The courtroom was eerily silent, the kind of silence that sends a chill down your spine. Ethan stood there, his heart racing as his eyes darted between the judge, the prosecutor, and the gallery of strangers who had gathered to witness his trial. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air thick with the weight of the situation. But it wasn't just any trial. It was the moment that could shape the rest of his life. He was just 17 years old, barely more than a kid. How had it come to this? His mind raced, but his body felt frozen. His palms were slick with sweat, his legs like lead. A glance at his mother in the front row did little to calm his nerves. She was there, but her face was etched with worry. She had tried so hard to shield him from this, tried to protect him from the world that so often seemed unforgiving. But here he was, accused of something he hadn't done, standing alone in a sea of unfamiliar faces. The judge, a stern, middle-aged man with glasses perched low on his nose, peered down at Ethan with an expression of mild amusement. Ethan could feel the disdain radiating from him, even from across the room. The judge's lips twitched, as if suppressing a smile. "So, young man," the judge began, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "You're telling me that this accident, this whole mess, was just that? An accident?" Ethan swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. He had practiced this moment 1,000 times in his head, but now that he was here, facing the judge's cold, scrutinizing gaze, it was all slipping away. The words felt stuck, trapped in his throat. His mouth went dry, and all he could do was nod. "Yes, Your Honor. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was just an accident," Ethan managed to mutter, his voice barely audible. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. The corner of his mouth curled up in a sarcastic smile. "An accident, huh? You know, I've heard that excuse 100 times. But you're still here, aren't you? And now we have to sort through the mess you've caused." Ethan felt a pang in his chest, a mix of humiliation and frustration. The judge wasn't just skeptical, he was mocking him. Ethan had never felt so small in his life. This wasn't just about the consequences of his actions. It was about his very worth being questioned in front of everyone. The entire room felt like it was closing in on him. The prosecutor, a woman with sharp features and an even sharper tone, stood up and addressed the court, her voice dripping with disdain. "Your Honor, let's not waste any more time. The evidence is clear. This young man made a choice, and now he must face the consequences. He's trying to paint himself as some innocent bystander in this, but the truth is, he's just another troubled kid who doesn't think about the consequences of his actions." Ethan's stomach churned. How had everything gotten so twisted? The truth was far more complicated than anyone in this room seemed to realize. But the more he tried to explain, the more it seemed like no one was listening. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, her eyes narrowing, "we're not here to entertain excuses. We're here to make sure that justice is served." The weight of her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. He tried to steady himself, but the ground beneath him felt unsteady. His mother's eyes burned into the back of his skull, filled with hope and fear in equal measure. She believed in him. He knew she did. But in that moment, it felt like the entire world was against him. The judge cleared his throat, his gaze never leaving Ethan. "Well, it seems we have our work cut out for us. It's clear this young man needs some guidance and a lesson in responsibility. We'll see if he's learned it by the end of this trial." Ethan could feel his face flush with embarrassment as he stood there, vulnerable and exposed. His mind raced, wondering how he had ended up here, in this nightmare that was quickly spiraling out of his control. How had his life turned into something that felt so meaningless? And then, just as the room was starting to feel like it might swallow him whole, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out from the back of the courtroom, deep and unmistakable. "I think it's time for a new perspective." The crowd went still. Ethan's head snapped toward the sound of the voice, his heart skipping a beat. There, standing at the door with an air of quiet confidence, was none other than Elon Musk. Ethan blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. Was this some kind of joke? Was the richest man in the world really standing in the doorway of a courtroom in the middle of his trial? The room was in chaos as whispers spread like wildfire. What was he doing here? The judge's expression shifted from mild amusement to shock. Mr. Musk? He stammered, clearly taken aback. Elon stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room with a cool, calculated gaze. He was dressed simply: black jeans, a dark t-shirt, and a jacket that looked like it had been chosen for practicality rather than style. But despite his humble attire, there was something magnetic about him, something that commanded attention. "I'm here to represent the defense," Elon said, his voice steady but carrying an undeniable authority. Ethan's jaw dropped. This was impossible. There was no way this was real. Elon Musk, the man who had revolutionized space travel, electric cars, and technology as a whole, was standing here in his defense? The idea seemed absurd. "Mr. Musk," the judge began, his voice trembling slightly, "this is highly irregular. Are you even a licensed attorney?" Elon smiled, a small, enigmatic grin. "I may not have a law degree, but I've got something far more valuable. I understand how to solve problems. And that's exactly what we're going to do today." The courtroom was in an uproar, people murmuring in disbelief. Ethan could hardly process what was happening. Was this a dream? Was Elon Musk really here to help him? "Your Honor," Elon continued, his gaze locking with the judge's, "I believe the circumstances of this case are far more complex than they appear, and I intend to show you just how wrong your assumptions are." Ethan's heart leaped in his chest. For the first time that day, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just his fate that was at stake anymore. It was a chance for him to change everything. Maybe, just maybe, this trial wasn't the end of his story. Maybe it was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Ethan had always been the type of person who felt like he was running in place, no matter how fast he tried to go. He wasn't the most popular kid in school, nor was he the smartest or the most athletic. But he had always tried his best, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. And more than anything, he wanted to prove to everyone, especially his mom, that he could make something of himself. Growing up wasn't easy for Ethan. His mom, Caroline, was a hard-working single mother who had done everything she could to give Ethan a decent life. They lived in a modest apartment in the outskirts of town, and while they didn't have much, Caroline always made sure they had enough. Ethan's dad, who had left when he was just a baby, was a shadow in his life, an absence he didn't quite understand but always felt. As far back as he could remember, it was just him and his mom against the world. Caroline was tough, but there was a tenderness in the way she spoke to Ethan, a constant reminder that no matter how tough things got, he was always loved. She was the one who had taught him how to be strong, how to keep pushing forward even when life seemed unfair. But even her strength had limits, and Ethan knew that. There was a sadness in her eyes sometimes, especially late at night when she thought he was asleep, and he would hear her muffled sobs as she tried to find a way to make ends meet. Despite everything, Ethan never once blamed her. He loved her more than anything. He knew she was doing her best, but a part of him couldn't help but feel a deep ache every time he saw his friends with their dads, every time he was reminded of the things his family couldn't afford. School was the one place where he felt like he could escape it all, but even there, he struggled. He wasn't a straight-A student, and while he wasn't being bullied, he wasn't exactly the most popular kid either. He kept to himself mostly, burying his head in books and taking solace in the occasional moments when he could lose himself in his imagination. Then there was Alex, his best friend since childhood. Alex was everything Ethan wasn't: outgoing, confident, and always ready with a joke to lighten the mood. But somehow, Alex had stuck by him all these years, even when it seemed like everyone else had their own lives to live. Their friendship was one of the few constants in Ethan's life, and Alex always had his back, even when Ethan didn't believe in himself. "Dude, you're overthinking it," Alex would say whenever Ethan started doubting himself. "You're way smarter than you give yourself credit for. And you've got a heart that's bigger than anyone I know. Just be you, man. People see that." But no matter how many times Alex reassured him, Ethan had trouble believing it. He wanted to be more than just the quiet, bookish kid. He wanted to be someone who made a difference, someone who mattered. And maybe that's why he was so determined to prove himself, even if it meant taking risks he didn't fully understand. One of the biggest risks he'd taken had been just a few weeks before the trial, when everything went wrong. He had been in a heated argument with his mom, the kind of argument that had been brewing for months. Ethan had gotten into a fight at school, something that seemed like a minor issue at the time, but it had escalated quickly. His mom had warned him, time and time again, not to get involved in things he couldn't control, but Ethan was tired of being the good kid, the one who always played by the rules. "I just want to make a name for myself, Mom," he had shouted during one of their arguments. "I'm not going to be stuck in this apartment for the rest of my life. I need to do something big." His mom had tried to calm him down, but the frustration in Ethan's voice had been hard to ignore. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Ethan. You just need to stay true to who you are." But Ethan hadn't listened. He had started hanging out with the wrong crowd, thinking that maybe, just maybe, they would be the ticket to a better life. They had introduced him to new things that, at the time, seemed exciting even if they were dangerous. Things that felt like an escape from the pressures of his life, an opportunity to finally be someone. But it had all backfired. One night, Ethan had been with a few of his new friends when things took a turn for the worse. A car crash, a misunderstanding, and suddenly, Ethan found himself caught in the middle of something far bigger than he could have ever imagined. He had tried to explain that he was innocent, that he hadn't meant for anything bad to happen, but no one believed him. The evidence seemed damning, and in the eyes of everyone around him, he was just another troubled kid making excuses. When the police showed up at his door, Ethan felt his entire world crumble. He hadn't done anything wrong, but no one would listen. They had thrown him into a system that didn't care about the truth, and all of a sudden, the future he had once imagined for himself seemed so distant, so unreachable. The trial was a blur. The accusations piled up, and every time Ethan tried to defend himself, the walls seemed to grow higher. The prosecution painted him as just another delinquent, another kid who thought he could get away with anything. And even the judge, the person who was supposed to be impartial, had already made up his mind. Ethan was guilty in their eyes before the trial had even begun. But there was one thing Ethan didn't expect, one person who could change everything. As the days wore on and the trial continued, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, what was going to happen to him? Would he end up just another statistic, another kid lost to the system? Or could someone, just one person, see him for who he really was? That's when Elon Musk showed up. It felt like a dream, something too surreal to comprehend. Ethan's life, which had been spiraling out of control, suddenly had a new thread of hope woven into it. The richest man in the world, someone who had built companies that had changed the course of history, was standing in his corner. Why? How? Ethan couldn't figure it out, but he knew one thing. For the first time in what felt like forever, he had a chance. A real chance. The man who had sent rockets to space, who had revolutionized electric cars, was now here to help him. And somehow, someway, Ethan knew that everything was about to change. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Elon Musk walked down the aisle toward the defense table, the noise growing louder by the second. Ethan was still in disbelief, his heart pounding in his chest as he tried to process what was happening. The rich, powerful, world-changing CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, standing right here in front of him. Elon Musk's presence in the room felt like a sudden shift in the air, a weighty pause that stilled everything. His confidence was palpable, and yet there was something almost otherworldly about it. The man was a billionaire inventor, a visionary who had changed industries and redefined what was possible. And yet here he was, sitting down beside Ethan, ready to go to bat for him. Ethan couldn't fathom why. Why him? Why this case? The judge, still taken aback by Elon's sudden entrance, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. He looked at Elon, then at Ethan, and then back at Elon, obviously flustered. "Mr. Musk," he began, his tone less commanding than usual, "this is highly unusual. We have a clear set of procedures in place. You can't simply walk in here and—" "I understand the rules, Your Honor," Elon interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "But this case goes beyond rules. It's about finding the truth, and that's what I'm here to help with." The judge paused, clearly unsure how to proceed. Ethan could see the tension in the room building, the whispers growing louder. People were still trying to make sense of what was happening, but no one could deny that Elon Musk had everyone's attention. There was a certain energy in the room now, an undeniable sense that this trial was about to take a turn no one had seen coming. The prosecutor, a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and an air of impatience, stood up and raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Musk, I don't know what you think you can accomplish here, but this is not a playground for your experiments. This is a court of law, and we are here to deal with real facts, not fantasies." Elon smiled slightly, a grin that seemed to say, "Just wait and see." He turned to Ethan and gave him a reassuring nod before addressing the prosecutor. "I'm not here to play games. I'm here to show you the facts that haven't been considered yet. I'm here to help Ethan." The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, clearly irritated. Ethan? A kid who's been caught up in the wrong crowd, engaging in reckless behavior and thinking he could get away with it? "Do you think that's what this is, Mr. Musk?" Elon didn't flinch. "I think Ethan is a victim of circumstances. A boy who's been misunderstood, caught in a situation he didn't choose. But if you're asking whether he's guilty, the answer is no. Not of the charges that have been brought against him." The prosecutor huffed, clearly not used to being challenged like this. "This isn't a charity project for you, Mr. Musk. We're talking about real consequences, real lives. And that's why I'm here," Elon responded calmly, "to make sure the real truth is heard." The tension in the room was thick now. The judge, still recovering from the initial shock, looked from Elon to Ethan and back to Elon. "Very well. You're welcome to present your argument, Mr. Musk, but I'm warning you, this better be more than a publicity stunt." Elon nodded, his expression serious. "It's not a stunt, Your Honor. I'm here for one reason, to make sure this young man gets a fair chance." And with that, the courtroom fell silent as Elon stood up and approached the witness stand. He wasn't just any lawyer. He was a genius, a problem solver on a level no one in that room could have anticipated. His mind worked in ways that no one else's did, and as he began to speak, it was clear to everyone that he wasn't just here to defend Ethan. He was here to completely change the course of this trial. "Your Honor," Elon began, his voice firm but measured, "I've reviewed the evidence in this case, and I've noticed something that no one has seemed to pay attention to." He turned toward the prosecutor. "You're focused on the actions of a teenage boy who got caught up in a situation that spiraled out of control. But what if I told you that the real issue here is much bigger than that? What if I told you that this entire case is built on a misunderstanding, one that has been completely overlooked?" The prosecutor's eyes flashed with irritation, but she said nothing. The judge, however, leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "Go on, Mr. Musk. What do you mean by that?" Elon smiled, the glint of a man who knew he was about to reveal something game-changing. "I mean that Ethan is not the cause of the problem here. He's part of a larger chain of events, an event that was set in motion long before he was even born. You see, this case isn't about Ethan's character. It's about a failure in the system. The system that failed him and left him with no other options." Ethan's head spun. He had no idea what Elon was talking about, but whatever it was working. The tension in the room had shifted, and now the eyes of everyone were on Elon as he continued. "The fact is," Elon continued, "Ethan didn't create the circumstances he's found himself in. He didn't choose the environment he grew up in, but he is a product of that environment. The lack of resources, the lack of support, and the pressure of a world that judges him before he has a chance to prove who he really is. That's what brought him here today." The room was dead silent, no one sure how to respond. The judge sat back in his chair, clearly considering Elon's words. The prosecutor opened her mouth to argue, but Elon held up a hand. "Don't misunderstand me," Elon said, his voice sharp. "I'm not excusing bad behavior. I'm not saying Ethan is blameless. But what I am saying is that he didn't make the decisions that led him here with the same understanding that others might have had. He's a kid, one who deserves to be heard, to be given the chance to rise above his circumstances. And I'm here to make sure he gets that chance." Ethan felt his heart swell with gratitude. For the first time, someone was speaking up for him, someone who saw past the labels and the mistakes to see the person he really was. He didn't know how to process it, but it was the first flicker of hope he'd felt in weeks. The prosecutor, clearly thrown off balance by Elon's argument, tried to regain control. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a courtroom. We deal with facts, not philosophies. Elon met her gaze with unwavering confidence. And the fact is, Ethan deserves a fair chance to prove himself. The truth has been buried under layers of assumptions, and I intend to bring it to light. The judge looked at Elon for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured. We will proceed. But be aware, Mr. Musk, that this is not an open invitation for you to turn this trial into a public spectacle. Elon nodded, unfazed. I'll keep that in mind, Your Honor. But sometimes, the truth needs to be spoken, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Ethan's heart raced as Elon returned to the defense table, his confidence radiating through the room. Something had shifted, something fundamental. Ethan had no idea what would happen next, but for the first time, he wasn't just a victim. He was a person fighting for his future. And with Elon Musk by his side, he might just have a chance. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer just a place where lawyers and judges argued over facts. It had become a battleground, a place where truths that had been buried for far too long were starting to emerge. Ethan had no idea what Elon Musk's strategy was, but he could feel the weight of the moment settling on him. The room was on edge, everyone waiting for what would happen next. Elon sat back in his chair, arms crossed, as if he had already won. His demeanor was calm, almost detached, but Ethan could sense the energy radiating off of him. He was playing a dangerous game, but he was confident. He had the kind of quiet intensity that made you believe he was always 3 steps ahead. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, Ethan believed there was a chance. A real chance. The judge leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Mr. Musk, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority, I'll admit, your points are intriguing, but you've yet to provide any solid evidence that would exonerate the defendant. You seem to be arguing on moral grounds, not legal ones. What exactly are you proposing here? Elon's eyes sparkled with a knowing look. What I'm proposing, Your Honor, is that we look beyond the surface of the evidence. There are things here that haven't been fully examined. Ethan didn't simply fall into this situation by accident. There are factors at play, social, environmental, even psychological, that have led him to this point. And if we're going to seek true justice, we have to address those factors. The judge furrowed his brow, not entirely convinced, but clearly intrigued. And how exactly do you propose we do that? Elon stood up, his presence commanding the attention of the entire room. I'm requesting a psychological evaluation of the defendant, a deep dive into his background, his upbringing, and the circumstances surrounding the incident. This isn't just about whether he committed a crime. It's about understanding why he did what he did. The prosecutor's eyes narrowed, clearly not thrilled with the suggestion. A psychological evaluation, she scoffed. This isn't a therapy session, Mr. Musk. We're here to determine guilt or innocence based on the facts. I agree, Elon responded, his voice steady. But sometimes the facts are more complex than they first appear. And in this case, Ethan's actions weren't made in a vacuum. They were influenced by forces that go beyond what can be seen in a police report or a set of photographs. There was a pause in the room as everyone digested Elon's words. Ethan could feel the weight of them. The idea of being evaluated, of having his entire life examined under a microscope, was terrifying. But at the same time, it felt like the only way out. It felt like the one chance he had to prove he wasn't a lost cause. The judge tapped his fingers against the podium, clearly wrestling with the idea. This is an unorthodox request, Mr. Musk, he said slowly. But I'll allow it, on the condition that it is done by a licensed professional, and that the results are presented to this court before we proceed any further. Elon smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he had already anticipated this outcome. That's all I ask, Your Honor. A fair chance to make sure the full picture is considered. The prosecutor opened her mouth to protest, but the judge raised his hand, silencing her. This court is adjourned for the day. We will reconvene in 1 week, and I expect the evaluation to be completed by then. Mr. Musk, I trust you'll make the necessary arrangements." As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the session, the tension in the room loosened, but only slightly. Ethan stood frozen in place, unsure of what to think or feel. 1 week. It felt like both an eternity and a moment, depending on how he looked at it. He glanced at Elon, who was already gathering his things, looking as if he had just won a chess game. "Ethan," Elon said, turning to him with a small, reassuring smile. "This is your chance. Don't waste it." Ethan didn't know how to respond. He wasn't used to being given opportunities like this. He had always been the one who had to fight for everything, who had to scrape by and hope for a break. But now, here was a man who had made his billions by taking risks, by seeing potential where others saw nothing. And now he was giving that same chance to Ethan. Outside the courtroom, the world felt different. The heavy weight of the trial that had hung over Ethan's head for weeks was momentarily lifted, but the pressure of what was to come next was already starting to build. The evaluation, the examination of his life. What would they find? Would they see the truth, or would it be buried beneath layers of failure and mistake? Ethan's mind raced as he walked out of the courthouse, his mother beside him. She had been silent through most of the proceedings, but her eyes now looked at him with a renewed sense of hope. She had always believed in him, but it had been hard for her to see any way out of this mess. But now, with Elon Musk's unexpected intervention, things were different. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he wasn't alone. "I don't know what to say, Ethan," his mother whispered as they walked to their car. "I never thought this would happen. I never thought anyone would care enough to help you like this." "I don't know what's going on either, Mom," Ethan admitted. "But I think this is my chance. My chance to show that I'm more than just some mistake. I just have to make sure I don't screw it up." His mother squeezed his hand. "You won't. I believe in you." Ethan nodded, but his heart was still heavy. This wasn't over. The hardest part was still ahead. The evaluation would be grueling, personal, and invasive. And who knew what the experts would uncover? Would they see him as a victim of circumstances, or would they paint him as a lost cause? The one thing that was certain was that he couldn't back down now. Elon had given him a chance to tell his side of the story, and he wasn't going to waste it. He would face the evaluation, the scrutiny, and whatever came next, head on. He had to, because this was his moment, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The week leading up to the psychological evaluation was a whirlwind of emotions for Ethan. It wasn't just the anxiety of waiting for the evaluation itself, though that was certainly overwhelming, but also the crushing weight of the truth. The more he thought about what Elon had said in court, the more he realized how little he truly understood about himself. It wasn't just about the crime he was accused of, but the life he had lived up until now. The choices, the mistakes, the moments when he felt like he didn't have a choice at all. The evaluation had been scheduled for the following Monday, and Ethan couldn't escape the mounting pressure. His thoughts would drift to the upcoming session even when he was trying to focus on something else. He tried to prepare himself, but there was no way to really prepare for what was about to unfold. It was a cold morning when the day finally arrived. The courthouse loomed before him, its tall structure casting long shadows over the street. Ethan had walked these steps countless times, but today felt different. The weight on his shoulders was heavier than before. He wasn't just walking into a courtroom. He was walking into a room where the future of his life might be decided. When he and his mother entered the evaluation room, it was nothing like he had expected. There was no courtroom drama, no audience, no pressure of a judge's gaze. Instead, there was a simple, quiet office. A man and a woman, both in their 40s, stood up to greet him. The man introduced himself as Dr. Lee, a clinical psychologist with a reputation for working with troubled youths. The woman was a social worker, Sarah, who would be taking notes during the session. They both wore friendly, approachable expressions, but Ethan couldn't shake the sense that they were here to pick apart his life. "Ethan," Dr. Lee said with a warm smile, gesturing to a chair. "Please, make yourself comfortable. We're here to talk, not to judge." Ethan sat down, his legs stiff, his hands trembling slightly. He tried to keep his breathing steady, but his heart was racing. The room felt like a sterile interrogation chamber, though no one was being accusatory. It was just the quiet, penetrating calm of professionals who had seen it all before. "We're going to start with some simple questions," Sarah said as she settled into her chair. "We just want to understand who you are, what's led you to this point in your life." Ethan nodded, but inside, he felt a knot form in his stomach. He wasn't sure he was ready to open up. There were parts of his story that he had buried deep down, parts of his past that he didn't want to face. His mom's struggles, the fights, the disappointment, the feeling of always being the odd one out, never quite fitting in. But as Dr. Lee spoke, his voice gentle and soothing, Ethan found himself opening up. He spoke about his childhood, the constant tension in their small apartment, the way his mom always tried so hard to make things work but never quite seemed to get ahead. He told them about his dad, the man who had vanished from his life without a trace, leaving Ethan with a feeling of abandonment that had never quite gone away. As the minutes stretched into hours, Ethan's words seemed to tumble out uncontrollably, as though the floodgates had finally been opened. The counselor didn't interrupt, merely nodded and made occasional notes, her eyes never leaving him, as if she were seeing into his soul. At one point, Sarah asked about his friends, especially Alex. Ethan's throat tightened at the mention of his best friend's name. Alex had been his rock, his partner in crime, the person who always had his back, even when Ethan didn't deserve it. "Alex," Ethan began, his voice wavering, "he's the one person who's always been there. But I think I pushed him away too. I started doing things I knew weren't right. I thought it would make me feel better, like maybe I could finally be someone else, someone better." He looked down at his hands, ashamed. He had been too focused on fitting in, on being someone more than just the kid who sat at the back of the class. "You didn't feel like you could be yourself?" Dr. Lee asked softly, his voice sympathetic. Ethan nodded. "No, I thought I had to be something else. Someone who didn't have to struggle all the time. Someone who didn't have to be the quiet kid who always watched life from the sidelines." The more he spoke, the more Ethan realized just how much of his life had been spent pretending to be stronger than he was, pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. And now, sitting here, he finally understood the weight of those lies. The cost of pretending. As the session continued, the questions shifted. They began asking about the incident, the thing that had led to his arrest. Ethan had always been defensive about it, trying to brush it off as a misunderstanding. But now he realized that wasn't the whole truth. He had been reckless, yes, but there was more to it. There was this feeling, this deep emptiness, he said quietly, staring at the floor. Like no matter what I did, it wouldn't be enough. I was always trying to fill this void, and I just kept making it worse. The room fell silent. Ethan felt vulnerable, exposed, but somehow, it felt like a relief. For the first time, he wasn't holding his feelings back. He wasn't hiding behind anger or embarrassment. He was telling the truth, even though it hurt. When the session finally ended, Dr. Lee and Sarah exchanged looks. It was clear to Ethan that they had seen something in him, something he had been too afraid to acknowledge. "You've made a lot of progress today, Ethan," Dr. Lee said, his tone steady but full of compassion. "But the journey is just beginning. This evaluation is just one step, but it's an important one." Ethan nodded, but his mind was reeling. He had opened up about things he hadn't even realized he was holding on to. The flood of emotions had been overwhelming, but strangely, it felt freeing. As they left the evaluation room, Ethan's mom looked at him with a soft smile, her eyes filled with pride. She had witnessed the transformation in him, from the scared, defensive kid who had walked into that room to the young man who had begun to confront his own demons. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice breaking slightly, "I didn't know I had so much inside me, so much hurt." She wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close. "It's okay, Ethan. You're facing it now. That's what matters." They left the courthouse together, not knowing what the next chapter of this journey would bring, but for the first time, Ethan felt like maybe, just maybe, he could start to rewrite his story. He wasn't defined by his past. He was more than the mistakes he had made, and with each step, he was starting to believe it. The days following the psychological evaluation felt like they were moving in slow motion for Ethan. It wasn't just the weight of waiting for the results, it was the quiet aftermath of his emotional breakthrough. For the first time in his life, he wasn't hiding from his past or from his feelings. Instead of constantly pretending to be someone else, he was finally starting to accept who he truly was. And that terrified him just as much as it freed him. In the week after the evaluation, life around him seemed to continue as usual, but Ethan felt as if he were living in a different world. School felt distant. His friends, Alex included, had all but stopped talking to him after the incident. He couldn't blame them, not really. But every conversation seemed strained, and his world became smaller and smaller. When Elon called him the following Thursday to check in, it felt like a lifeline in the midst of his isolation. "Ethan, how are you holding up?" Elon's voice was calm, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts swirling in Ethan's mind. "I don't know," Ethan replied honestly. "I feel like I'm just waiting for everything to blow up. I told them everything, but what if it's too late?" "I know it's hard," Elon said. "But remember this. The fact that you're facing what's inside you is powerful. You've already done something most people would never do. You're confronting your past, and that's something people run from their whole lives." Ethan had to admit that Elon's words were starting to sink in. It was a lot easier to wallow in self-pity than it was to face everything head-on. But maybe there was some truth to what Elon was saying. Maybe confronting the past wasn't just about understanding it. It was about moving forward. "I'll do my best," Ethan said quietly. "I just don't know what happens next." "You're doing everything you can," Elon assured him. "The evaluation report is key, and once it's in, we'll figure out how to move forward. I've been working behind the scenes, and there are some things we need to look into. But the first step is always the hardest." As the call ended, Ethan found himself reflecting on Elon's words. The truth, he realized, wasn't just something that would be revealed through the evaluation. The truth was something that would take time to uncover, not only in the case but in himself. His emotions had been locked away for so long. It was as if the doors had only just been cracked open. That night, as Ethan lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from his mom. "The results are in. We need to meet with Dr. Lee tomorrow. Come home soon." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The evaluation results were in. He couldn't decide whether to be relieved or terrified. After everything he had shared with Dr. Lee, what would they say? Would it change anything? The next morning, he and his mother went to meet Dr. Lee at his office. It was a small, unassuming building tucked away in a quiet corner of town. When they entered the office, Dr. Lee was already waiting for them, his expression neutral but kind. "Ethan, Mrs. Richards, please have a seat," he said, gesturing to the chairs in front of his desk. "I've gone over the evaluation, and I'd like to share my findings with you." Ethan sat down, trying to steady his nerves. His mom took his hand, her grip firm, though he could tell she was just as anxious as he was. "First, let me say that Ethan was very open during the evaluation," Dr. Lee began, his voice calm but measured. "It's not often that I see someone so young willing to truly reflect on their past. That's a testament to his character." Ethan felt a small flicker of pride, but it was quickly followed by a wave of uncertainty. He wasn't sure what Dr. Lee would say next, but he was bracing himself for the worst. "As we went through the evaluation, we focused not only on Ethan's behavior but also on the factors that shaped his decisions," Dr. Lee continued. "What we found is that Ethan has been living in an environment that has made it difficult for him to trust others, to trust himself, and to see his worth beyond his mistakes. It's clear that he's been carrying a lot of emotional weight, which has impacted his choices." Ethan didn't know whether to feel relieved or overwhelmed. Dr. Lee was speaking in general terms, but Ethan could feel the weight of each word. "However, Dr. Lee added, looking at Ethan directly, what we also found is that Ethan has the capacity to change. His willingness to face his emotions, his past, and his future speaks to his potential. He is not beyond redemption. He is not defined by his actions or his past mistakes." For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt a tear slip down his cheek. It wasn't sadness, but a sense of relief. There had been a part of him that had wondered whether he was too far gone to be saved, but hearing Dr. Lee's words, it felt like a burden had been lifted. He's not perfect, Dr. Lee continued, and he still has a lot of work ahead of him. But he is capable of growth, and if he's given the right tools, the right support, I believe he can build a better future for himself. Ethan blinked, trying to keep his composure. His mom, on the other hand, had tears in her eyes as she squeezed his hand tightly. You've got a chance, Ethan, Dr. Lee said gently, but you'll need to be committed to the journey. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. The weight of those words hit Ethan like a wave. He had never really thought about the future in terms of change, of redemption. He had always thought about how others saw him, about how they would judge him. But Dr. Lee's assessment was different. It wasn't about whether Ethan was perfect. It was about whether he was willing to keep going, to keep trying. As they left the office, Ethan felt like a different person. The uncertainty was still there, but there was a flicker of hope in his chest. For the first time, he didn't feel like his past defined him. He could see the possibility of a different future. And that future, he realized, wasn't something that would be handed to him. It was something he would have to fight for. But he was ready. The days after the revelation from Dr. Lee were a blur. Ethan had a lot to process, so much more than he'd realized. The weight of the evaluation results and the words Dr. Lee had shared with him had triggered something deep within, something that both scared him and made him feel a small, hesitant glimmer of hope. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like there was a path forward, even if it was unclear, even if it was difficult. He wasn't trapped in his past anymore, even though it still haunted him. There was a chance, a real chance to rebuild. But rebuilding wasn't easy. The hardest part wasn't confronting his mistakes. It was learning how to believe in himself, to trust that he could change. He spent the next few days working through what Dr. Lee had suggested. That Ethan needed structure, therapy, and consistent support. The psychologist had set him up with a therapist who specialized in trauma, and they began meeting regularly. It wasn't an easy process. In fact, it felt like walking into a storm every time. But with each session, something within Ethan was changing. His mom, too, was doing her best to help him stay on track. Their relationship, which had been strained for so long, began to shift. They started talking more, not just about the trial, but about the past, about the hurt and the healing. Ethan found himself opening up more than he ever had before. He wasn't sure whether it was the therapy, his own desire to change, or the fear of losing everything. But slowly, things started to feel different. They weren't perfect, but they were better. Even the trial itself seemed to be taking a different shape. After the evaluation, Elon Musk's legal team worked tirelessly behind the scenes. And though Ethan wasn't always in the loop, he could feel the subtle shifts. It was like everything was aligning in a way that gave him more hope than he'd ever imagined. But just as things seemed to be moving in a positive direction, another shockwave hit. It came on a Friday afternoon, just after Ethan had finished his therapy session. He was sitting in the car with his mom, heading back to their apartment, when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something told him to pick it up. Hello? Ethan, it's Elon. Ethan blinked in disbelief. Elon? What's going on? I need to talk to you. Can you come to my office tomorrow? Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Is something wrong? No, it's not that, Elon said, his voice calm, though there was an edge to it. But there's something important I need you to hear in person. It's about your case. Ethan's stomach churned with anticipation. Okay, I'll be there. What time? 10 a.m. Don't be late. Before he could say anything else, the line went dead. Mom, Ethan started, his voice shaky. Elon wants me to meet him tomorrow. He said it's important. His mom's eyes flicked to him, concern and curiosity dancing in her gaze. What could it be? You've been working with his team for weeks now. I don't know, Ethan replied, already feeling a gnawing sense of unease. But if it's about my case, it can't be good news. Why else would he want to meet me? She squeezed his hand. Maybe it's not bad news. Maybe it's the next step, something that will move things forward. Ethan wasn't so sure. He was afraid to get his hopes up, afraid that whatever Elon had to say would be another dead end. After all, every step of the process so far had been full of twists and turns, and while he'd had moments of hope, they'd been quickly dashed by reality. He wasn't sure how much more of the emotional roller coaster he could take. That night, He barely slept. His mind raced with possibilities. What could Elon have to say that was so urgent? His head was spinning with worst-case scenarios, each one more catastrophic than the last. He thought about how everything had seemed to finally be moving in the right direction after the evaluation, and now, here he was, teetering on the edge of what felt like another cliff. The next morning, Ethan showered, dressed in the best clothes he could find. His mom had insisted he look his best for the meeting, and tried to steady his nerves. They arrived at the office just before 10 a.m., and as they entered the sleek, modern building, the familiar feeling of doubt crept back into his mind. He was led into Elon Musk's office, a large, open space filled with sunlight and floor-to-ceiling windows that gave an expansive view of the city. It looked nothing like the cold, sterile places he was used to. This was a world far removed from anything he had ever known. Elon stood by the window, looking out at the city. He didn't turn to face Ethan immediately, but seemed deep in thought. "Ethan," Elon said, finally turning to look at him, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming." Ethan nodded, trying to control his breathing. "What's going on, Elon? Is something wrong with the case?" Elon motioned to a chair across from his desk. "Please sit down." Ethan complied, his hands clenched in his lap. There was something in Elon's demeanor that had shifted. This was no longer just about the legal battle. Something else was happening, and Ethan could feel the weight of it. "I've been looking over everything," Elon began, his voice low and steady. "The psychological evaluation, the trial notes, everything. And there's something I need to tell you." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "What is it?" Elon leaned forward, his expression serious. "Ethan, the truth about this case. It's bigger than you or me. The forces at play here are more complicated than I originally anticipated. What you've been through, it's part of something much larger." Ethan's confusion deepened. "What do you mean? What's larger?" Elon's eyes locked onto his. "I can't go into all the details yet, but there are powerful people involved in this case who've had a hand in shaping the narrative. People who have manipulated events for their own gain. And they're not going to let you go quietly." Ethan's stomach dropped. "Are you saying this is all rigged?" "I'm saying that there's more going on here than meets the eye," Elon replied, his voice unwavering. "And you're caught in the middle of it. But you have an advantage. You have the truth on your side." Ethan could hardly process the enormity of Elon's words. A conspiracy? Powerful people pulling strings behind the scenes? It was like something out of a movie, but this was his life, and it felt like the ground beneath him was slipping away. "I'll help you," Elon said firmly, "but you need to trust me. We need to expose this." Ethan was speechless. His mind was racing, trying to grasp what Elon was saying. But one thing was clear. This was no longer just a simple trial. This was a fight for the truth, one that was bigger than he ever could have imagined. And now, Ethan had to decide whether he was ready to face the truth, even if it meant risking everything. Ethan sat in the plush chair across from Elon, still processing what he just heard. Powerful people behind the case, manipulating events for their own gain. He couldn't even begin to wrap his mind around it. This wasn't just a legal battle. This was something much bigger than him, something more dangerous. He glanced at Elon, searching for more clarity. But Elon wasn't offering any immediate answers. Instead, he stared at Ethan with a look that combined patience and expectation. "I know it's a lot to take in," Elon finally said, breaking the silence. "But you need to understand, the case isn't just about what happened with you. There's a bigger narrative being crafted. A narrative that some very influential people are trying to control. And they'll do whatever it takes to keep it that way." Ethan rubbed his forehead, the weight of everything starting to press down on him. Was he even capable of handling something so massive? His life had been a series of bad decisions, a broken home, a constant struggle to fit in. Now, he was being asked to confront a conspiracy, a shadowy world of power and influence he hadn't even known existed. He wasn't a hero. He was just a teenager trying to survive. But there was something else nagging at him. Something Elon had said. "You have the truth on your side." Could it really be that simple? Was the truth powerful enough to expose the people behind this? Ethan wasn't sure, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let his fear dictate his future. Not anymore. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Ethan admitted, his voice shaky. I don't even know where to begin. Elon nodded slowly, acknowledging his fear. Nobody ever feels ready. But that's where you have to trust yourself. You're more capable than you think. A tense silence settled between them. Ethan's mind was racing, his heart pounding. The weight of the decision was suffocating. This was a turning point. If he took this step, there was no going back. He would be involved in something far beyond his understanding, something that could change everything. Ethan glanced at his phone, the time blinking back at him. It was nearly noon. His mom would be waiting for him, anxious about what Elon had said. He had promised her that this meeting was crucial, but he hadn't prepared her for anything like this. You mentioned that there's a bigger picture here, Ethan said, trying to regain some control. Who are these people you're talking about? Why are they doing this? Elon's face hardened, his gaze turning distant for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low, almost conspiratorial. I can't give you all the details right now. There are people who don't want this information to get out. But I will tell you this isn't just about your case. This goes deeper. There are people who have used their influence to manipulate outcomes, to protect themselves, and to control public opinion. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This was bigger than anything he could have imagined. But why would they want to target me? What's my role in all of this? That's what we need to figure out, Elon replied. You're caught in the middle of a larger game. But the reason this is happening to you is because you represent something they don't want exposed. You're a symbol, whether you realize it or not, of what they're trying to keep hidden. You've got the truth on your side, and that's why they're fighting so hard to keep you quiet. Ethan was overwhelmed. He had always seen himself as just a kid who made mistakes, a kid who was struggling to survive. Now, he was suddenly a pawn in some larger game, his life hanging in the balance. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about him. This was about the truth. And maybe, just maybe, the truth could be his way out. I'm not sure how I can do this, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've never been involved in anything like this. I'm just trying to get through the day without messing up again. Elon leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Ethan's. You've already done something most people wouldn't be able to do. You've faced your past. You've opened up about your struggles. That's more than half the battle. Now it's about using that courage to fight for something bigger. You don't have to do it alone. I'll be with you every step of the way. Ethan could hear the sincerity in Elon's voice. The billionaire tech mogul wasn't just offering legal advice or strategies. He was offering something deeper. He was offering Ethan a chance to stand up for what was right, even if it meant risking everything. The choice was clear, but that didn't make it any easier. Ethan could walk away, go back to his normal life, and let the powers that be win. Or he could step into the unknown, take a leap of faith, and fight for the truth. But the consequences were enormous. There was no telling where this path would lead, how it would change him, or how much it would cost him. And yet, deep down, Ethan knew that he couldn't let fear rule him anymore. For the first time in his life, he had the opportunity to stand up for something that truly mattered. The weight of his past didn't have to define him. His future was still unwritten. He took a deep breath, meeting Elon's gaze. I'm in, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear swirling inside him. I don't know exactly what I'm up against, but I'm willing to fight. For the truth. Elon smiled, a rare, genuine smile. I knew you had it in you, Ethan. You've just taken the first step. The road ahead won't be easy, but you've got what it takes. Ethan's heart raced as he stood up, the magnitude of the decision settling in. The path ahead would be hard. He didn't know if he was ready for everything that was coming, but he knew one thing. He wasn't backing down. As they walked out of Elon's office, a sense of purpose filled Ethan's chest. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about fighting for what was right, about reclaiming control over his life and his story. He had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a purpose. The fight for the truth had just begun. The moment Ethan left Elon's office, the weight of the decision he'd just made settled heavily on his shoulders. There was no going back now. He had crossed a threshold, and the road ahead was filled with uncertainty, danger, and questions he couldn't yet answer. But as daunting as it seemed, there was a part of him that felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. The truth had a strange pull, a magnetic force that drew him in, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. On the drive back to his apartment, Ethan's mind buzzed with everything Elon had said. Powerful people manipulating events, controlling public opinion, and the conspiracy surrounding his case. It all sounded like something straight out of a thriller. But this wasn't fiction. This was his reality. The truth was buried in a tangled web of lies, and it was up to him to uncover it. When they got home, his mom could tell something was off. She didn't ask directly, but her eyes were full of questions as they sat down to dinner. Ethan toyed with his food, lost in thought. His mom hadn't been briefed on everything Elon had said, and for good reason. This wasn't something he could explain over a simple dinner conversation. The stakes were too high. Instead, Ethan just told her the basics. Elon's working on some stuff behind the scenes, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady. He thinks there's more to the case than we know, and he wants me to help figure out what that is. His mom looked at him, concern furrowing her brow. What do you mean? Help with what? I don't know yet, Ethan admitted. But it's bigger than just me, Mom. Something's going on, and I need to be part of it. She fell silent for a moment, her gaze never leaving him. I just want you to be careful, Ethan. It sounds like it's getting dangerous. I know, Ethan said softly, but I can't ignore this. I have to find out the truth. His mom sighed and reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. I'm scared for you, but if this is what you think you need to do, I'll support you. Just promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't go too far. I promise, Ethan said, squeezing her hand gently. I'll be careful. The next morning, Elon called again, and this time, the tone of his voice was different, more serious. We need to move fast, Elon said, cutting straight to the point. I've uncovered something, and we can't afford to wait any longer. Ethan's heart rate spiked. What did you find? Elon paused for a moment, then spoke in a hushed tone. There's a connection between your case and a group of individuals who have been influencing public trials for years. They have ties to corporate entities, even government agencies. I've been doing some digging, and it looks like they've been manipulating the system to protect their interests. They've been pulling strings from behind the scenes. Ethan felt his stomach churn. What does that have to do with me? Everything, Elon replied. You're a part of a much larger agenda. They're using you to push a narrative, one that serves their purposes, not the truth. And if they succeed, they'll do this to more people. They'll continue to control the narrative, control the truth. Ethan's mind was reeling. He had never imagined that his case would be connected to something so massive. But as terrifying as it sounded, a part of him understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about his future. It was about exposing something that could change the way the system worked, something that had the potential to expose a dark underbelly of corruption and manipulation. I don't know where to start, Ethan admitted, feeling overwhelmed by the enormity of the task ahead. How do I even begin to take this on? You don't have to do this alone, Elon said. I've got a team, and we'll help you. But we need to be discreet. We can't let anyone know we're onto them. Not yet. This needs to be strategic. Ethan nodded, swallowing his anxiety. What do I do? We need to start by gathering information. You've been through the legal system, but now we need to dig deeper. There's a pattern here, and we need to find out who's behind it all. I've got a few contacts who can help us get access to the documents, but we need you to do one thing for me. Get close to the people involved in your case. The judge, the opposing attorneys, anyone who might be connected to the bigger picture. Ethan felt a lump in his throat. How am I supposed to do that without raising suspicion? That's the tricky part, Elon said. You'll need to play it smart. Don't let them know what you're doing. But I know you, Ethan. You're resourceful. You can do this. As the conversation ended, Ethan felt a mix of dread and determination. He didn't know how he was supposed to infiltrate the very system that had once been used to condemn him, but if there was even a chance to expose the truth, he had to try. Over the next few days, Ethan began putting the pieces together. Elon's team worked with quiet precision, helping him gather public records, connect the dots, and access information he never would have been able to on his own. But it wasn't enough to just have the facts. Ethan needed to go deeper. The first step was to get close to the key players in the trial: the judge, the prosecutor, and the defense attorneys. Elon had warned him not to raise suspicion, but there were only so many ways to observe people without drawing attention. He had to find a way in, and fast. It wasn't long before Ethan found an opportunity. He had been called in for a brief meeting with his defense attorney, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah. She had been instrumental in getting his case off the ground, and despite her tough exterior, Ethan had come to trust her. When he sat down in her office, she looked at him with an unreadable expression. "I've been hearing rumors, Ethan. People are starting to talk." Ethan's stomach tightened. "What kind of rumors?" "I don't know yet," Sarah said, leaning forward, "but there's something off about this whole case. You're not the only one who's been targeted. We're not dealing with an ordinary trial here. There's something bigger going on, and I don't trust some of the people involved." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This was the break he'd been waiting for. Sarah was onto something. "Do you think it's connected to the people Elon's been investigating?" Ethan asked cautiously. Sarah nodded, her eyes narrowing. "I don't know, but I'm going to dig into it. I'll keep you updated." As he left her office, Ethan felt the first stirrings of hope. He wasn't alone in this. Sarah was on his side, and with Elon's team helping behind the scenes, they might just have a chance to uncover the truth. But the road ahead was long, and it would take everything Ethan had to navigate the dangerous waters ahead. The investigation had officially begun. The following week felt like an eternity. Each day was filled with meetings, calls, and quiet, discreet steps forward. Elon's team had set up a secure network for Ethan to communicate with them, and every conversation felt like a calculated risk. The more Ethan uncovered, the more he realized just how deep the rabbit hole went. Sarah, his defense attorney, had started her own investigation into the shady dealings surrounding his case. She was digging through legal documents, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing trial transcripts. It was clear that she didn't trust anyone involved in the process, and her skepticism was becoming more justified with every piece of information she uncovered. But it wasn't enough. They needed to get closer to the heart of the conspiracy. Ethan spent the following days carefully observing everyone around him: the judge, the attorneys, even the small-time players in the court system. Every person seemed to be part of a larger, intricately woven web. But the more he watched, the more he realized that it wasn't just about the trial. This was about something bigger, something that had its tendrils in nearly every facet of society. One afternoon, after a long day of shadowing various players in the trial, Ethan received a message from Elon. "Meet me tonight. I have something important to show you." Ethan's heart raced. This wasn't just another update. There was something big happening. He texted his mom to let her know where he was going, grabbed his jacket, and headed out the door. The meeting spot was a discreet cafe on the outskirts of town. It was a place that felt both safe and unsettling, a place where secrets could be exchanged without attracting too much attention. When Ethan arrived, Elon was already there, sitting at a corner table, his back to the wall. He looked up as Ethan approached and gestured for him to sit. "I have something you need to see," Elon said immediately, his voice low. "This is the next step." Ethan's curiosity piqued as he sat down. "What's going on?" Elon slid a manila folder across the table. "These are internal documents from a group I've been tracking. They're connected to your case, but they're also connected to several other high-profile trials in the last decade. This group has been pulling strings behind the scenes, manipulating trials, controlling outcomes, and silencing anyone who gets in their way." Ethan hesitated, picking up the folder with trembling fingers. He flipped it open, scanning the contents. There were detailed records of meetings, coded emails, financial transactions, proof of connections between powerful individuals and corporations. The names of influential judges, prosecutors, and even political figures were scattered throughout the documents. As Ethan read through the pages, his stomach churned. The depth of this operation was unlike anything he had imagined. "Who are these people?" Ethan whispered. Elon leaned in, his expression grim. "A group of corporate executives, legal strategists, and political insiders. They've built a network over the years, using their power to control the narrative around major cases. They've been manipulating public perception and controlling outcomes in courtrooms across the country. Your case is just one in a long line of manipulated trials. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a conspiracy, it was an empire of corruption. And his case was only the tip of the iceberg. Why am I being targeted? Ethan asked, the question burning on his tongue. Because you're a threat, Elon replied, his voice steady. You've become the symbol of their wrongdoing. You're the piece of the puzzle they never expected. If they lose you, their entire network could crumble. And they'll do whatever it takes to keep that from happening. The weight of Elon's words hit Ethan like a freight train. He was no longer just a teenager caught in the crossfire. He was now the target of a powerful, shadowy force that controlled everything. But with that realization came a spark of defiance. He wasn't going to let them win. I won't let them get away with this, Ethan said, his voice firmer than he expected. Elon nodded, a small, approving smile forming on his lips. I knew you had it in you. Just as they were about to discuss their next steps, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. He quickly read it. Ethan, I think I found something. Meet me tomorrow morning. I need you to see this. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Sarah's found something. I need to go. Elon stood up, his expression serious. We need to be careful. If Sarah's found something, it could be the key to everything. But we can't let anyone know we're onto them. This is dangerous, Ethan. These people don't play by the rules. I'll be careful, Ethan said, determined. I have to do this. As he left the cafe, the weight of everything he just learned settled back into his bones. The pieces were finally starting to come together, but that meant they were getting closer to exposing something that could bring down a vast network of corruption. And with every step forward, the danger grew. The next morning, Ethan met Sarah at a quiet park bench on the edge of town. She was already there, pacing, her eyes scanning the area. As soon as she saw him, she waved him over. Ethan, you need to see this, Sarah said, holding up a stack of papers. I've been going through old court records, and I found something strange. These documents connect the judge from your trial to the same network Elon's been tracking. Ethan's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Sarah handed him the papers, and as Ethan flipped through the pages, he saw it. A pattern of strange rulings, favored outcomes for specific corporate entities, and an unexplained connection to the very people who had been orchestrating the trials. It was all right there, staring him in the face. This is huge, Ethan murmured, his mind racing. How did you find this? I've been digging into the judge's past cases, Sarah said, her voice low. There's a clear pattern of bias. The investigation had just taken a major turn. They were no longer just uncovering a conspiracy. They were about to bring it into the light. And Ethan was ready to fight for the truth. Ethan felt like the walls were closing in around him. The evidence that Sarah had uncovered about the judge's biased rulings was explosive, and it was just the beginning of what they knew. The network of corruption that they were up against was bigger and more entrenched than he had imagined, and every step they took seemed to bring them closer to a dangerous tipping point. Sarah and Ethan met with Elon the next day, their nerves taut as they sat in the sleek conference room of one of Elon's private offices. The usual calm, composed air around Elon was gone. There was an edge to him now, a sharpness that reflected the gravity of the situation they were all in. We need to act, and we need to act fast, Elon said, leaning forward with a focused expression. I've gone over the data, and it's worse than I thought. This isn't just about a single trial or a group of crooked lawyers. This goes all the way to the top. Ethan's stomach tightened. What do you mean, all the way to the top? Elon didn't hesitate. I mean that people with power, real power, are pulling the strings. I've traced some of the financial records, and they lead directly to high-profile politicians, business magnates, and even a few individuals in the judiciary. People who can make or break entire industries. If we're going to expose this, we're not just fighting for justice in your case anymore. We're taking on a whole system. A heavy silence filled the room. Sarah and Ethan exchanged a look. They had known this fight would be dangerous, but hearing it out loud made the stakes feel even more terrifying. Force them to respond in ways they don't want to. If we can get enough people on our side, we can shake their grip on the system. Ethan felt a surge of hope, but it was fleeting. How do we even begin? We're just a handful of people against, well, all of them. Sarah leaned forward. We start small. We use the information we have now. We make sure it's airtight. Then we reach out to a few trusted investigative journalists. Get them to ask the right questions. Once that ball starts rolling, we'll leverage the power of public pressure. Ethan nodded, though doubt still lingered in the back of his mind. The fight ahead was colossal. They weren't just exposing corruption in his case. They were going up against an entire system designed to protect the very people who had been manipulating everything. Elon, do you think we have enough to take them down? Ethan asked, his voice quiet but determined. Elon gave him a sharp look. We have more than enough. The question is, do you have the stomach for it? This will get ugly. People will fight back. And not just with words. They have resources, they have influence, and they have ways of silencing those who threaten them. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Elon's words. He had never imagined his life would take such a turn, but this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about doing what was right. It was about showing the world that truth still mattered. I'm in, Ethan said, his voice steady now. I've come this far, and I'm not backing down. Elon smiled, but it was a small, somber smile. Good, because this is only the beginning. From here on out, we're playing their game. We need to be sharp, strategic, and we need to move quickly. The plan began to take shape over the next few days. The documents Sarah had uncovered were carefully analyzed, each piece of evidence scrutinized for leaks, holes, or any inconsistencies. Elon's team worked behind the scenes, preparing to release the information to a few key journalists they knew they could trust. People who were independent, not controlled by the powerful figures they were up against. They also began putting together a timeline, mapping out key players involved in the network of corruption and organizing their next moves. It wasn't just about releasing the information. They needed to build a narrative that would stick, one that would resonate with the public and create a ripple effect. Ethan found himself at the center of the storm. The more he learned, the more he realized just how big of a target he had become. The people they were about to expose wouldn't take kindly to being outed. There were too many at stake. But Ethan couldn't back down now. He'd made a promise to himself and to his mom that he wouldn't let fear control him anymore. He had a voice, and it was time to use it. The night before they planned to make their first move, Ethan couldn't sleep. His mind raced with all the possibilities. What could go wrong? What would they do if the network pushed back? Could they protect themselves from the fallout? His phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. Ethan, there's something you need to know. I've uncovered a deeper connection. The judge who ruled on your case, he's been paid off. Not just once, but multiple times over the years. I'm sending you the evidence now. Ethan's heart dropped. He opened the file Sarah had sent, and his worst fears were confirmed. The judge wasn't just corrupt. He was deeply embedded in the network. And it wasn't just his case that had been manipulated. The judge had influenced countless others, all for a price. Ethan stood up, pacing the small room, his mind whirling. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. But the truth was right in front of him. And tomorrow, they were going to expose it. He took a deep breath, clutching the phone in his hand. There was no turning back now. This was their moment. And they had to make it count. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The night before the planned release of the documents felt suffocating. Ethan tossed and turned in his bed, the weight of the decision hanging over him. Tomorrow wasn't just the beginning of a battle. It could be the beginning of a war against powerful figures who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The moment the public got wind of the corruption behind his case, there was no going back. His phone buzzed again, and Ethan groggily grabbed it from the nightstand. It was a message from Elon. Everything's in place. Tomorrow's the day. Are you ready? Ethan stared at the message for a long moment before responding. As ready as I'll ever be. The response came almost immediately. Good. Just remember, this isn't just about you anymore. This is about the truth. Ethan set the phone down and stared at the ceiling, the events of the past few weeks replaying in his mind. He couldn't help but think back to that moment in the courtroom when the judge had mocked him. How small and helpless he had felt. Now, He had the chance to make it right, to expose the people who had put him in that position. But would it be enough? Would he be able to bring down a network so powerful, so entrenched, that it seemed untouchable? At dawn, the first wave of the plan kicked into motion. Elon's team had coordinated with a select group of journalists, independent reporters who had proven time and time again that they weren't afraid to go after the big stories. The journalists received the leaked documents, and they were briefed on how to frame the story. The plan was to break the news slowly, piece by piece, creating a sustained narrative that would keep the pressure on. Ethan's phone buzzed again, and this time it was Sarah. "I'm meeting with the reporters today. It's happening." Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline rush through him. This was real. The world was about to find out. But even as he thought about the imminent exposure, doubt crept in. What if they weren't ready for the backlash? What if the network they were up against had anticipated this move and had already started to push back? He quickly shook off the thoughts. There was no time for doubt now. The truth had to come out. Ethan and Sarah had agreed to meet up at a quiet cafe to discuss the next phase of their plan. When Ethan arrived, Sarah was already sitting at a corner table, her phone in hand. She looked up as he approached and gestured for him to sit. "I'm nervous," Sarah said, her voice tight with tension. "This could go south very quickly." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "But we can't let fear stop us. We're doing the right thing." Sarah nodded, but her brow furrowed as she glanced around the cafe. "I know we're doing the right thing, but the people we're up against, they're not just going to sit back and let this happen." Ethan didn't need to hear it spelled out. He knew exactly what she was talking about. The people in power had resources, legal resources, financial resources, and even people on the inside. They wouldn't just let this go without a fight. "We're ready for them," Ethan said, trying to convince himself as much as Sarah. "We have the truth, and we have a public that's tired of being lied to. That counts for something." The conversation was interrupted by a text from Elon. "The first article's live. Get ready." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The clock had started ticking. The first article was out, the floodgates were open, and there was no turning back. They both checked their phones as the notifications flooded in. The article's headline blared across the screen. "Court system corrupted. Judge involved in massive scandal manipulating high-profile trials." Ethan's heart pounded as he read the opening lines of the article. "In an explosive new investigation, documents have emerged showing a deeply corrupt network operating within the judicial system. At the center of the scandal is Judge William Harper, who allegedly accepted bribes from corporate interests and powerful political figures to manipulate verdicts in high-profile trials. These revelations are part of an ongoing investigation into a network that has been controlling the outcomes of court cases across the country. Sources say this network has been operating for years, with far-reaching implications that could affect countless cases still pending in the courts." Ethan could hardly believe it. The moment he had feared was now upon him. He reread the article, the words sinking in as his pulse raced. But there was no time to relish the victory. He knew this was only the beginning. The first of many articles was out, and now the world was watching. As the day wore on, more articles followed. Each one connected the dots, slowly revealing the full extent of the corruption that had been hidden in plain sight for years. It wasn't just Judge Harper. Names of politicians, business executives, and even law enforcement officials were mentioned. It became clear that the network was vast and deeply embedded in every layer of the system. Ethan watched as the story began to explode across social media. People were furious. They were demanding answers. The public outrage was palpable, and the pressure was mounting. But the people they were up against were not going to take this lying down. As the day wore on, reports began to surface of counterattacks, smear campaigns designed to discredit the journalists, threats against those who were speaking out, and rumors that some of the witnesses involved in the case were disappearing. It was exactly what Elon had warned them about. The system would fight back, and it would fight dirty. At the same time, they also saw the first cracks in the facade. Powerful figures who had long been untouchable were now scrambling, trying to control the narrative. It was clear that the network had underestimated the public's appetite for the truth. The pressure was on, and the clock was ticking. That night, Elon called Ethan to check in. "You did well today," Elon said, his voice calm but full of resolve. The story's out there, and there's no going back now. But be ready, they're coming after us. They won't sit idly by. Ethan leaned against the wall, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. I know. I'm ready. You have to be, Elon replied, because they'll stop at nothing to protect themselves. Just as the conversation ended, Ethan's phone buzzed again. It was another text from Sarah. Ethan, I just got a call. They know we're coming for them. They've already started pulling strings. I need you to be careful. This just got real. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't just a teenager caught in a legal battle anymore. He was in the middle of a war, and there was no turning back. The pressure had only just begun. But as he stared at the message, a strange sense of clarity washed over him. The truth was out. The fight wasn't over, but it had begun. And no matter what came next, Ethan wasn't going to stop until the whole world saw the corruption for what it was. The following days were a blur of constant updates, media coverage, and the relentless assault of news outlets, both supportive and hostile. Ethan could barely keep up with the flood of calls and messages from reporters, legal experts, and concerned citizens who were all reacting to the bombshell revelations about the judicial corruption network. The articles Elon's team had orchestrated had spread like wildfire. Social media was ablaze with hashtags calling for accountability, and videos of protesters marching in front of courthouses were quickly going viral. People were rallying behind Ethan, demanding justice, demanding answers. The more the story spread, the more people began to believe that there was hope for real change. But with every bit of public support came an equally powerful backlash. Ethan's phone buzzed constantly with new notifications, many of them hateful, threatening, and cruel. Anonymous accounts on social media were spreading false information, trying to paint Ethan as a liar and a troublemaker. Rumors that he had been paid off or was part of some larger conspiracy began to spread like wildfire. The network wasn't going to let their secrets slip so easily. Are you okay? Sarah asked one evening, her voice tinged with concern. Ethan had been holed up in his apartment, trying to block out the noise, but the messages and attacks kept coming. I'm fine, he lied, even though the anxiety gnawed at him. The threats had started to become more personal. A few days ago, he'd received a message that made his stomach drop. It was a photo of his family's house, taken in the dead of night. The caption simply read, "Next time, it won't just be you we go after." Ethan had to resist the urge to panic. He knew the network was capable of anything, and this was just the beginning. Are you sure? Sarah pressed. Because I've seen some of the stuff they're putting out about you. They're trying to discredit everything. Ethan sighed, staring at the stack of documents on his desk. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. Every move they made, every piece of evidence they released, made them more of a target. He knew the public was on their side, but he also knew the people they were fighting had far more resources than they did. We knew this was coming, Ethan said, trying to steady his voice. We knew they'd fight back, but we can't stop now. We're so close to taking them down. Sarah was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was firm but supportive. You're right, but we have to be smart about this. They're going to try to break us. They'll do anything to keep their power. We have to stay 2 steps ahead of them. Ethan didn't know how to explain the mix of fear and determination building inside him. They were in a race against time now. Every day that passed, the pressure grew. The public was rallying behind them, but the system was fighting back just as fiercely. If they were going to win, they had to keep pushing forward. There was no turning back. The next day, as if on cue, Elon reached out with a new message. We've got a problem. A big one. They're trying to silence key witnesses. A journalist we were working with has gone missing. Ethan's heart sank. What do you mean, gone missing? Elon's response came quickly. They took him. We've confirmed it. He was working on a follow-up article about the network's connections to major political figures. We've already alerted the authorities, but we can't trust anyone involved in the system at this point. The news hit Ethan hard. A journalist who had been helping them, someone who had been digging into the same people Ethan was up against, was now gone, vanished without a trace. The people behind the network were sending a clear message. Stop digging or pay the price. Ethan was no longer just fighting for justice in his own case. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by this system. The stakes had never been higher. "We can't let them intimidate us," Ethan said, more to himself than anyone else. "We can't stop now." Sarah was silent for a moment before replying. "We won't, but we need to be careful. The deeper we dig, the more dangerous it gets. They won't hesitate to go after you next." Ethan didn't respond. He knew the risks. But the truth was out now, and there was no going back. The next few days passed in a haze of frantic planning and deepening tension. The authorities were investigating the disappearance of the journalist, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were stalling. He'd seen it before. How corruption ran so deep in certain systems that even the law couldn't be trusted to protect those who fought against it. But it wasn't just the authorities who were a problem. The legal teams for the corrupt network were becoming more aggressive too. Ethan's case, the very case that had sparked this avalanche of truth, was being quietly swept under the rug. The trial date had been moved up, and there was an unsettling sense that they were preparing to push the whole thing through quickly, before any more evidence could be uncovered. Ethan met with Elon again, this time in a more secure location. A private conference room with a metal door and a single round table. Elon was calm, but his eyes betrayed the worry that had been building over the last few days. "We need to act now," Elon said, looking directly at Ethan. "We can't wait for the authorities to solve this. We can't wait for the next journalist to go missing. We need to expose the people behind this network in a way they can't control. We have to take the fight directly to them." Ethan looked at the stack of documents in front of him, the ones Sarah had helped uncover, documents that were more than just evidence. They were a roadmap to the heart of the conspiracy. Every name, every detail was a piece of the puzzle they needed to finish. But the risks were enormous. They had already seen what these people were capable of. "What do you mean, take the fight to them?" Ethan asked, unsure of what Elon was suggesting. Elon leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I mean, we need to put everything on the table. Every piece of evidence, every document, every name we have. And we need to force the public to hold these people accountable. We'll take it directly to the media, but not just any media. We need to go straight to the people who've been silent all this time. Independent journalists, public figures who have the power to expose them. It has to be big, really big." Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the chance to end it all, to take down the entire network in one blow. But as he looked at Elon, he couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Was it possible? Was it too dangerous? "We'll do it," Ethan said finally, his voice steady. "But we need to make sure we're ready. We can't afford any mistakes." Elon nodded, his eyes burning with determination. "We're going to win this. We have to." And just like that, they set their plan into motion. The battle for the truth was only beginning, and Ethan knew that this time, there would be no going back. The calm before the storm was over. Ethan had barely gotten a moment to catch his breath before the next wave of attacks came crashing down. The plan they had put into motion was audacious, exposed the entire corrupt system in one fell swoop, and it was going to be a risk like nothing they had faced before. But nothing felt safe anymore. The network had already shown its hand, and there was no turning back. The next morning, Elon sent an urgent message. "We need to act fast. The pressure is mounting, and there are whispers about a counterstrike from their side. They'll hit us where it hurts. Be ready." Ethan didn't need to ask what that meant. They were getting ready to fight back. The system they were up against, an intricate web of corrupt judges, powerful politicians, and corporate elites, wasn't going to let a few leaks and articles unravel their control. They were going to hit back with everything they had. Sarah was already at the office, working with the team of journalists who had become their key allies. They were coordinating the release of the next set of explosive documents, the final proof that would tie the whole network together. Names were being linked to money trails, covert meetings, and shady backroom deals. But with every minute that passed, Ethan knew they were closer to the danger. The deeper they went, the more violent the resistance would become. The pressure on the journalists was palpable. Calls came in all day from sources that were now under threat, trying to warn them off. Their leads were drying up, and those who had been in contact with them were slowly retreating into silence, clearly fearing for their own safety. Every step forward was met with increasing pushback. Later that afternoon, Ethan received another message. this time from a source he hadn't heard from in weeks. "We have eyes on you. The network knows what you're planning. They've already started to mobilize. Be careful." Ethan's blood ran cold. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Elon. "It's worse than we thought. They're moving fast. They have people in the media, in the courts, and even in law enforcement. Someone is trying to cover up everything we've exposed." Ethan's mind raced. He had known this fight was dangerous, but he hadn't anticipated just how deep the corruption went. The network wasn't just connected by money. It was connected by power, by influence that reached into every corner of society. Even those he had trusted, the officials who were supposed to be on their side, might be compromised. The clock was ticking. The press was about to be unleashed. If they could just expose the network before the counterattack was fully mobilized, it might be enough to turn the tide. But it wasn't going to be that simple. Later that evening, as Ethan sat in his apartment, reading through the next batch of documents that had been leaked to him, the power went out. It was sudden, darkness enveloping the room in an instant. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and his first instinct was to check his phone for any messages. There were none. He stood up, trying to calm himself. Maybe it was just a routine blackout, but the air felt different, colder. There was an eerie silence that replaced the usual hum of the city. The sudden darkness had a weight to it, an unshakable feeling that something was off. Just as he reached for the door, his phone buzzed again, its screen lighting up in the darkness. He grabbed it quickly and unlocked it. The message was brief but chilling. "They know. They're coming for you." The words sent a cold shiver down his spine. He scanned the room, half expecting someone to appear at the window, or a shadow to shift in the corner of his eye. But there was nothing. The silence remained, unnervingly still. He quickly texted back, "Who is this?" There was no response for several minutes. He glanced at the door again, then back at his phone. Something wasn't right. Then, his phone buzzed once more, this time with an ominous voice message. It was from an unknown number, the sound of static briefly overtaking the first few seconds. Ethan hit play, his fingers trembling slightly. The voice on the other end was low, almost a whisper, distorted but clear enough for him to understand. "You should have stayed out of it, Ethan. The people you're trying to take down don't like to be exposed. You're going to regret this." Ethan's stomach dropped. The voice wasn't familiar, but the threat was unmistakable. His mind raced, scrambling for the next move. The network wasn't just trying to protect itself, they were actively coming after him. His family, everything he'd built. But Ethan wasn't backing down. The fight had only just begun, and he had come too far to stop now. Grabbing his coat, he bolted for the door, knowing that he couldn't waste any more time. Elon had always warned him that this was going to get ugly, but now he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a fight for justice. This was a fight for survival. At the same time, Sarah was sitting in a dimly lit room with one of the investigative journalists who had been helping them. The situation was growing dire, and her gut told her that this might be the last time they'd be able to meet without being caught. "We're about to release everything," Sarah said quietly. "The final set of documents. This is the one that will tie them all together. But they're already trying to bury it. I can feel the heat coming down." The journalist looked at her gravely. "They've been trying to intimidate me too. Every time I talk to a source, I can feel eyes on me. They're shutting people down. They're shutting down access to the courts, to the records, to everything." Sarah clenched her fists. "That's why we need to act now. We've got the public behind us, but we need to get the rest of the world to see what's going on. We can't let them win. Not after all this." "I agree," the journalist said, his voice tense. "But we have to be careful. They've got too many people on the inside. We're not just up against a few bad actors anymore. We're up against the system itself." Sarah nodded, her resolve hardening. "I know, but if we don't take this shot, we lose everything. We can't let them silence us." As they continued to prepare the final release, the weight of their task settled over them. They weren't just exposing a scandal. They were pulling back the curtain on an entire system designed to protect the corrupt. The system was fighting back, and they had to be ready for anything. But as the pressure mounted, one thing was certain. They couldn't stop now. The tension in the air was palpable. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something monumental, but also dangerously close to the edge of disaster. The phone call from Elon that morning had been brief but urgent. "We're going live. Tonight. It's all going out. Every piece of the puzzle. Are you ready?" Ethan stared at the message, his heart pounding. He knew this was it. The culmination of everything they had worked toward. Exposing the corrupt network, unmasking the judges, politicians, and corporate elites who had built their empires on lies. If they succeeded, they could change the course of justice in the country forever. But if they failed, the consequences would be catastrophic. A small group of trusted allies had been working around the clock to prepare the documents for release. A new coalition of investigative journalists, activists, and legal experts had formed, all dedicated to unveiling the truth. They had agreed on one crucial thing. This wasn't just about one man, one case, or one corrupt network. It was about the entire system, and how it needed to be torn down and rebuilt. But no matter how many people believed in the cause, no matter how powerful the truth was, there was always a price to pay. The network wasn't going down without a fight. Ethan met with Sarah later that afternoon in the safe house they'd been using for strategy meetings. It was a small, unremarkable place, a far cry from the opulent offices they'd been used to, but it was secure. And that's all that mattered now. Sarah was hunched over a laptop, her fingers flying over the keys as she double-checked the release schedule. The final document, the one that would tie everything together, was ready. It had the names, the connections, the evidence of corruption and bribery that linked the highest levels of government with the most powerful corporations in the world. It was all there, on paper, irrefutable proof. "This is it," Sarah said, looking up at Ethan. There was no fear in her voice, just determination. "We're about to burn everything down." Ethan nodded. His mind was racing. They had come this far, but there was no turning back. As much as he believed in the power of truth, he knew they were up against a force much larger than any of them. A force willing to destroy anyone who stood in its way. "We need to be careful," Ethan said. "The counterstrike is coming. I can feel it. They'll try to bury this. They'll go after the press, the sources, anyone connected to us. We can't afford to make any mistakes." Sarah paused, her expression serious. "I know, but we can't wait any longer. The world needs to know what's happening behind closed doors. We have to take this risk." Ethan took a deep breath. He had to admit she was right. They couldn't afford to sit back any longer. It was time to bring the fight to them. That evening, as the final release went live, the world seemed to hold its breath. News outlets across the country picked up the story. Social media exploded with reactions, outrage, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of urgency. The documents had been released to trusted journalists and outlets who were ready to broadcast the information to the world. But there was one key difference this time. This wasn't just a report. This was evidence that could change everything. Ethan watched as the numbers of viewers ticked up in real time, his nerves tightening with every passing second. He sat in front of his screen, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. The message was out. There was no turning back now. Then, as the first wave of reactions began flooding in, something unexpected happened. The system fought back immediately. A sudden flurry of legal motions, injunctions, and court orders appeared from nowhere, attempting to halt the release, accusing journalists of spreading misinformation and threatening heavy fines and arrests. But the public wasn't fooled. The story had already gained enough momentum. People were already sharing the documents, the videos, and the names, spreading the truth faster than the network could suppress it. The backlash from the corrupt system only fueled the fire. As the hours passed, the pressure mounted. The network's retaliation had begun. It wasn't just legal threats anymore. It was personal. Ethan received another chilling message. "We warned you, Ethan. Now we're coming for everything." His blood ran cold. The threats had escalated from vague insinuations to direct intimidation. They knew who he was, where he lived, who his family was. They were going to make him pay. But Ethan wasn't backing down. He couldn't. The truth had already been exposed. The public outcry was overwhelming, and the more the corrupt network tried to silence it, the more the world took notice. The media, both independent and mainstream, began to dig deeper, their eyes turning toward the powerful figures who had been operating in the shadows for years. For the first time, the system was shaking. The foundation of power was beginning to crack. But as the storm of reactions continued to build, so did the danger. The following morning, Ethan and Sarah were in the middle of a heated discussion about the next steps when Elon called them. His voice, usually calm and collected, was tight with urgency. "They've already begun to move against us," Elon said. "One of the key journalists who was working with us, he's gone. We don't know where he is. We think they've kidnapped him." Ethan felt his heart sink. The journalist had been instrumental in verifying some of the more sensitive pieces of the puzzle. If they had him, it was only a matter of time before they started to break the network apart piece by piece. "We have to do something," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "If they start taking our people out, they'll stop the whole thing from going anywhere." "We're going to fight," Ethan said firmly. "This isn't just about the documents anymore. This is about standing up to them, showing the world that we won't be silenced. We'll keep pushing. We'll keep exposing them." As the day wore on, the pressure continued to mount. The counterstrike had begun, and it was only going to get worse from here. But in the midst of the chaos, one thing became clear. They weren't going to give up. They had come too far, fought too hard, and sacrificed too much to let this story slip away now. The storm was breaking, but it wasn't over yet. The real battle had just begun. The world had shifted. In a matter of hours, the leak had transformed into a full-blown global phenomenon. The documents were everywhere. On TV, on social media, on every front page of every news outlet. The names of judges, politicians, and CEOs who had once been untouchable were now laid bare. And the truth about the scale of corruption was spilling into the public eye like a flood. The network had been exposed, but not without consequences. The backlash was swift and brutal. Ethan stared at his phone, feeling the weight of the words he'd just read. Another journalist had been found dead under suspicious circumstances. The authorities had ruled it as an accident, but Ethan knew better. It was a warning. If they didn't stay ahead of the network, they'd be exposed, cornered, and silenced. "We need help," he said, the realization hitting him. "We need people on the inside. People who can get us the final pieces we need to bring them all down once and for all." Elon had been quiet for the past few hours, letting the storm of media coverage settle before reaching out again. Ethan knew he was probably busy handling his own side of the fight. But now, as the pressure grew, Elon called them to a meeting. "We've got a new lead," Elon said, his voice clipped with urgency. "I've managed to get in touch with someone who knows the inner workings of the network. They've been in deep for years, but they're ready to talk. We need to meet them in person." Ethan's heart raced. This could be the break they needed. The missing link. The person who could provide the final pieces of the puzzle and take down the entire corrupt network. "But we need to be careful," Elon warned. "They'll be watching. We can't trust anyone in their orbit, and we can't afford to let this leak before we're ready." It wasn't a risk Ethan could ignore. This person, whoever they were, could hold the key to everything. They might have information that could put the final nail in the coffin for the network, bringing down its entire structure. But the risks were enormous. "I'll meet them," Ethan said, the words coming out before he had fully processed the gravity of the situation. He had no choice. If this was the opportunity they'd been waiting for, they had to take it. The plan was set. They would meet at a location in the city, an old, abandoned building that had been chosen for its obscurity. It was a place where they could talk in private, where the risk of surveillance was minimal. The journalist who had connected Elon to the informant was already on the ground, making sure everything was set. As Ethan and Sarah made their way to the location, the city seemed to hold its breath. The streets were eerily quiet. People had started to panic as the truth about the network spread, unsure of who to trust or where to go. The public's rage was growing, and with it, the fear that something even more dangerous was lurking beneath the surface. When they arrived at the building, the air felt charged. The cold concrete walls seemed to close in on them, and the dim light from a flickering bulb cast long shadows in the hallway. There was an unsettling feeling in the pit of Ethan's stomach. The closer they got to the meeting point, the more his instincts told him that something was wrong. But there was no turning back now. They entered the building, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The room they were supposed to meet in was empty. They waited in tense anticipation, the clock ticking. And then, suddenly, the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside. A man, hooded and cloaked in shadow. He moved quickly, his gaze darting nervously around the room. "It's not safe here," the man whispered, his voice strained. "They know. They've already got eyes on you." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a trap. The network had known they'd come for this informant, and they'd been waiting for them to walk right into their grasp. Before he could react, a deafening sound of shuffling footsteps came from the hallway. The trap was closing in. "Get out!" the informant shouted, pushing past them. "Now! They found us!" Ethan's heart raced as he grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the back exit. The last thing he heard before the building erupted into chaos was the man's desperate voice, warning them one final time. "Don't trust anyone." Ethan and Sarah barely made it out. They ran through the alleys, adrenaline coursing through their veins, their footsteps pounding in sync with their racing hearts. The trap had almost been sprung, but they had escaped, just barely. As they finally reached the car and sped away into the night, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the network was closing in faster than they could run. It wasn't over yet. The storm was far from finished. Ethan and Sarah sat in the car, the engines hummed the only sound as they sped through the dark streets. Their breaths came in quick, uneven bursts, adrenaline still surging through their veins after barely escaping the trap. The night was thick with tension, and every shadow that passed by the windows seemed to hide a threat. The city was alive with whispers. The truth had exploded into the open, and the chaos was only just beginning. Ethan knew that this was a turning point, the point where the network would stop being subtle and start getting desperate. And when desperate people are threatened, they're capable of anything. "Do you think they'll come after us next?" Sarah's voice was tight, her hand gripping the seat as if it might anchor her. Ethan didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he wasn't sure. They had barely escaped the building, but they had also lost a crucial lead. An informant who had been ready to bring down the entire structure of the corrupt network. The network's response had been swift and ruthless. If they had figured out the informant's identity, there was no telling what they'd do next. Who else could be trusted? Sarah asked again, a note of desperation in her voice. "If they knew where we were, what's stopping them from knowing where everyone else is?" Ethan's mind raced. They had to move fast, but not recklessly. The truth was out there, but the clock was ticking. Every moment they spent planning, every step they took, was a risk that could cost them everything. "We need to talk to Elon," he said, finally. "We need to make sure we're not walking into another trap." A few minutes later, Elon's voice came through their phones. He sounded just as shaken as they felt, though he tried to mask it with his usual calm tone. "I have eyes on you," Elon said quickly, his voice strained. "You're not safe where you are. The network has already mobilized. They know everything." Ethan felt a pang of frustration, but he knew Elon was right. Every move they made was now under constant surveillance. "I don't think the informant is going to make it," Ethan said, his jaw tightening. "This is bigger than we thought." Elon paused before speaking, his voice lowering. "I've been monitoring the movement of key players within the network. They're scrambling to contain the leak, but it's already too late for them to stop it entirely. What you've exposed, it's too big. They're terrified. That's why we have to strike now," Ethan said firmly. "The longer we wait, the more chance they have to regroup." Elon sighed, a hint of weariness creeping into his voice. "You're right, but we have to be smart. This isn't just a political game anymore. This is life or death for us, and for everyone who helped us. We need backup." "Do you have a plan?" Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the tension. "I have a few ideas," Elon said, "but it's risky. I'll send you the details. Just know that it's the only way forward. We're going to have to go deeper, deeper than we ever expected. If we don't do this, the network will continue to use its power to bury this story. We can't let that happen." Ethan's mind raced as he listened to Elon's plan. It was dangerous, far more dangerous than he had anticipated, but it was their only shot. "I'm in," Ethan said, the words leaving his mouth without hesitation. "Good," Elon said, his voice firm now. You'll get the plan by the morning. Be ready. We're running out of time. The next morning, Ethan and Sarah met up at the designated location, a safe house set up by Elon's contacts. The building was isolated, tucked away in a quieter part of the city. The windows were covered with thick curtains to block any prying eyes, and the security system had been upgraded to the highest level. It was the kind of place where they could talk without the fear of being overheard, or worse. As they entered, Elon was already there, sitting at the table, his eyes glued to his laptop. His usually calm demeanor had a sharp edge to it now. The stakes had changed. You both made it out, Elon said, looking up from his screen. Good. But we're not safe yet. Tell us the plan, Sarah said, her tone resolute. Elon didn't hesitate. He leaned forward, his eyes locked onto theirs. We need to get to the heart of the operation. The network isn't just a few corrupt politicians. It's a global operation that spans governments, corporations, and the media. The only way to shut it down completely is to expose the key players, the ones who've been pulling the strings all along. And we're going to need someone inside to help us. Ethan's brow furrowed. Inside where? The network has a private legal arm, elite lawyers who cover their tracks, handle their dirty business, and protect their interests. They work with judges, law enforcement, and media to bury evidence, control the narrative, and manipulate legal proceedings. We need one of those lawyers to flip, and I think we know just the person. Elon tapped a few keys on his laptop, pulling up a file. He turned the screen toward them. The image that appeared was that of a woman, tall, dark hair, sharp features. This is Samantha Reed, Elon said. She's one of the top attorneys in the country. If she's still working for them, she's your key to taking them all down. Ethan studied the photo. There was something unsettling about it. Samantha Reed was known for handling high-profile cases that were often shrouded in secrecy. The kinds of cases where the law didn't seem to apply. The kind of lawyer who made deals behind closed doors. And if she was involved with the network, she was as dangerous as they came. You want us to convince her to flip? Sarah asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. Elon nodded. Yes, we'll get her to talk. She's been on the inside for years. She knows everything, and if we can get to her, she'll help us bring down the entire operation. But how do we get to her? Ethan asked, his tone skeptical. Elon's eyes flicked to the screen again. We don't approach her directly. She's too smart for that. But there's a way in. Her involvement in one of the high-profile cases we've been tracking is the key. We use that. We use her guilt. Ethan's heart raced. This was it, the chance to get the insider they needed. The only problem was, it wasn't going to be easy. Samantha Reed wasn't just some lawyer. She was one of the most powerful figures in the network, and convincing her to flip would require more than just evidence. It would require something she wanted even more than power. Let's get to work, Ethan said, his voice filled with a sense of finality. This is our last chance. As the plan began to take shape, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of what was ahead. They were about to walk into the lion's den. Samantha Reed had the power to either save them or destroy them. But there was no turning back now. The final pieces of the puzzle were within reach. And the storm? It was just beginning to build. Ethan stared at the screen, his eyes fixed on the face of Samantha Reed. She was a puzzle, a key figure in the network, and yet, they knew so little about her. The plan Elon had laid out seemed simple on the surface, but Ethan knew better than to think it would be easy. Convincing someone like Samantha Reed to betray everything she had built, all the power she had accrued, was going to take more than just a clever argument. It would take leverage, the kind of leverage that no one could ignore. How do we even get to her? Sarah's voice broke through Ethan's thoughts. She had been pacing around the room, her mind working through the complexities of their plan. We start with her ego, Elon said, his fingers clicking on the laptop. She's a power player, and power players always leave traces. All we have to do is find where she's vulnerable. Once we do, we use it. Ethan nodded, though a part of him still felt uneasy. They were about to make a dangerous move. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. This was about confronting a woman who had her hands in everything, someone who could easily crush them if they didn't handle this delicately. Elon continued, Samantha Reed is currently tied to several high-profile cases that are under heavy scrutiny. One of them is a corporate case involving a massive energy company, and she's been on the inside, handling everything to ensure that the company stays protected. We know that there are some serious skeletons in that company's closet. Environmental violations, illegal lobbying, corruption at every level. We have enough to tie her to the wrongdoing, and that's where we start. Sarah frowned. We blackmail her with that? No, Elon said, shaking his head. We give her a choice. If she doesn't flip, she's going to go down with them. We let her know that the evidence we have can destroy her career, her reputation, everything she's worked for. But if she agrees to help us, we can make it disappear. She'll get out clean. Ethan exhaled slowly, considering the plan. You think she'll buy it? She'll have no choice, Elon replied, his tone confident. People like Samantha only understand one thing, self-preservation. And the people she's working with are dangerous. They'll throw her under the bus without hesitation if it suits them. It sounded plausible, but Ethan couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. They were walking a razor-thin line. One wrong move, and Samantha could turn everything back on them. The next day, they put the plan into motion. Elon had arranged for them to meet with one of his trusted contacts, someone who had inside knowledge of the case Samantha was handling. This person, a whistleblower who had worked within the energy company, had been collecting evidence for years. If anyone knew Samantha's weaknesses, it was him. Ethan, Sarah, and Elon met the contact at a dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of the city. The man, who went by the name Greg, was cautious, glancing over his shoulder every few seconds as though afraid someone might be watching. He was nervous, but determined. He knew how much was at stake. I've been waiting for you, Greg said, his voice low, almost a whisper. You can't trust anyone in this game. Not even the ones you think you know. They're all in on it, Samantha included. Ethan leaned in, listening carefully. What do you know about her? Greg hesitated, clearly weighing his words. She's not like the others. She's not some small-time player. She's been involved in every major deal, every shady transaction, from the ground up. She's untouchable, at least, she used to be. Sarah shifted, her gaze hardening. What's her connection to the company? She's their fixer, Greg continued, glancing nervously around. She's the one who ensures that everything stays quiet. Any environmental violations, illegal contracts, she makes them disappear. She's the reason the company's still operating with no consequences. Ethan felt a wave of realization wash over him. Samantha Reed wasn't just an attorney in the network. She was a cornerstone. Without her, the entire operation could crumble. But if they could take her down, they'd have the power to dismantle the entire network. And how do we get to her? Elon asked, his voice cool. Greg leaned closer, lowering his voice to a near whisper. She's meeting someone tonight. I don't know who, but I've tracked her schedule. She always meets at the same spot, a private room in an old hotel on the edge of the city. It's always after hours, and it's always someone important. I've never been able to find out exactly who, but if you're there, you might catch her off guard. Ethan exchanged a look with Sarah, then with Elon. It was risky, but it was their only shot. If they could catch her in a vulnerable moment, they might be able to strike a deal. That night, they arrived at the hotel, run-down building that had seen better days. The air was thick with humidity, and the dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows on the cracked pavement. They parked a few blocks away, making sure to keep a low profile. The less attention they drew, the better. Inside, the hotel was eerily quiet. The lobby smelled musty, the air stale. They moved quickly, checking the old hotel's floor plan that Elon had acquired. The private room was on the third floor, down a long, narrow hallway that ended at a door marked Staff Only. As they crept down the hall, the sound of soft voices filtered through the walls. Someone was already inside. It had to be Samantha. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he motioned for Sarah and Elon to stay quiet. They stopped just outside the door, trying to make out the conversation. From the few words they could catch, it was clear that Samantha wasn't alone, and that the conversation wasn't about business. She's meeting with someone powerful, Elon whispered. His eyes narrowed. If we don't move now, we'll lose our chance. Ethan didn't need another word. He nodded, signaling for them to move in. They pushed open the door, and what they saw sent a chill through Ethan's spine. Samantha Reed was sitting at a table, but the person across from her wasn't just another corporate suit. It was someone far more dangerous, someone Ethan recognized immediately. It was the judge, the one who had been at the heart of the corruption scandal, the one who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, the man who had been untouchable until now. Ethan's mind spun. They had walked into a trap. This was no coincidence. Samantha was part of the inner circle, and they had just walked right into the heart of it. The air inside the dimly lit room grew thick as the doors swung open. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, the scene before him more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. Samantha Reed, the attorney with ties to the deepest corners of the corrupt network, was sitting at the table. Across from her sat Judge Gregory Hale, the very same judge whose name had come up again and again in the investigation. Ethan had expected a lot of things. This wasn't one of them. Samantha's eyes flicked up to meet Ethan's, and for a split second, there was no recognition. Then, her cold gaze sharpened, and the tension in the room spiked. "What is this?" she asked, her voice smooth, but with an edge of uncertainty. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. The judge's face, which had been calm and composed, shifted just slightly, a flash of recognition crossing his features. But he quickly masked it with a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You really thought you could bring down all of this without consequences?" Judge Hale's voice was low, smooth, and as dangerous as a snake's hiss. He leaned back in his chair, looking at them with an unsettling calmness. "You've made a mistake." Ethan's mind raced. They were in deep now. If they were caught here, this could all end in a matter of seconds. His eyes flicked to Sarah, whose grip on her weapon was tight, her posture rigid with tension. Elon was standing behind them, his eyes scanning the room for exits. It was clear that this wasn't just a meeting of power, it was a confrontation. "You don't understand the game you're playing," Samantha continued, her tone shifting from surprise to something far colder. "This isn't just about a few corrupt officials or a few shady deals. It's about control. This network has been in place for decades, pulling the strings of governments, businesses, and the media. You think you're going to break it all down just like that?" Ethan didn't flinch, though the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. They had known they were taking on something far bigger than they had anticipated, but hearing it from someone so entrenched in the system made it feel that much more real. "You've been part of it all along," Sarah shot back, her voice tight with anger. "You've protected the guilty, buried the truth. And now, you think you can walk away clean?" Samantha's lips curled into a small, cold smile. "I never walk away clean. I make sure I'm in control of everything before I move. You've been playing checkers in a world of chess." Ethan stepped forward, keeping his voice calm but firm. "You're not invincible. We have enough evidence to expose everything. You know that. It's just a matter of time before it all comes crashing down on you." The judge chuckled, a sound that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "You're underestimating how much control we have. You can't just expose something that has been carefully hidden for so long. We've covered every angle. Even if you have the evidence, it won't matter. You're just a small part of a much bigger game." Samantha exchanged a look with Hale, and it was clear they were both considering their options. "Your little team might be able to expose a few low-level people, but you'll never reach the core. Not without our help," Samantha said, her gaze turning back to Ethan. "And right now, I'm offering you a chance to work with us." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had prepared for confrontation, for a struggle. But this was something he hadn't expected. They weren't offering a fight. They were offering a deal. "You're offering us a way out?" Ethan's voice was laced with disbelief. "Not a way out," she replied coolly. "A way in. We can make this go away. All of it. The evidence, your involvement, everything. You work with us, and we ensure your safety. All you have to do is accept the offer." Ethan could feel Sarah's eyes on him, her body tense beside him. She was as skeptical as he was. The idea of working with someone like Samantha was unthinkable, but the temptation was there. Safety, security, and most importantly, power. For a moment, the room felt like it was closing in on him. This was the moment where they could either back out or dive deeper into the chaos. They had already crossed too many lines to go back. But this was different. "You're not offering us a way out," Sarah spoke up, her voice sharp. "You're offering us a way into your web. We're not stupid enough to believe you." Samantha's smile never faltered, but there was something in her eyes that darkened just slightly. "I'm giving you a choice. But don't mistake me. If you refuse, we will find you. And everything you've done, everything you think you've exposed, it will disappear." Just like that. There was a long silence. Ethan's thoughts were racing. Could they really walk away from all this? Could they afford to let the network continue to thrive just because they couldn't stomach working with the people behind it? Or was this the only way to truly take it down from the inside? "I'll take that chance," Ethan finally said, his voice cold, resolute. Sarah looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," he replied, turning back to Samantha. "But I want guarantees. I want your help to bring down the core of this network. You give us that, and we'll work together. But if we find out you're playing us, if we find out you're still loyal to them," Samantha's smile never wavered, "then you'll know I was never on your side in the first place." Judge Hale stood up, his chair scraping loudly across the floor. He wasn't in a hurry, but there was an undeniable presence to his movements. This isn't about sides anymore. This is about who controls the story. And right now, the story's in our hands. Ethan felt the weight of those words. The game was changing, and the rules no longer applied. They were in too deep to turn back now. "You'll hear from us," Samantha said, as the judge gave them one final look before walking toward the door. As the two of them exited, leaving Ethan, Sarah, and Elon behind, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. If anything, it intensified. There were no more easy choices. The lines were blurred. The world they were fighting to expose was far darker than they had ever imagined. But it was clear, this was only the beginning. The final move was still ahead, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their actions tonight had set something in motion that they couldn't stop. The night hung heavy with uncertainty as Ethan and his team sat in the cramped room, the dim light from a single bulb casting long shadows across the walls. The air was thick with tension. Samantha Reed's offer weighed on them all, but no one spoke for a while. They were processing, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Elon was the first to break the silence. "That was dangerous," he said, his voice calm but tinged with a rare edge of concern. "We've just thrown ourselves into the lion's den, and we need to be careful how we proceed. One misstep, and everything is over." Ethan nodded, but his thoughts were racing. Samantha's words echoed in his mind. "You're playing checkers in a world of chess." Was she right? Had they underestimated the depth of the game they were now a part of? Or had they just signed their own death warrants by agreeing to work with her? Sarah sat across from them, arms crossed, her eyes hard. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice tight with frustration. "Do we trust her? Do we just play along and hope we can take her down from the inside?" Elon sighed and leaned back in his chair. "We don't have the luxury of trust right now. We know what she's capable of, but we also know we're running out of options. If we don't move quickly, this network will swallow us whole." Ethan glanced at Sarah. "We don't have a choice," he said quietly. "If we don't act now, everything we've worked for will be in vain. This is bigger than just taking down a few bad actors. It's about exposing everything, no matter the cost." Sarah gave him a hard look, but in the end, she didn't argue. She knew the stakes as well as anyone, and though she hated the idea of working with Samantha, she knew that if they were going to succeed, they had to keep their enemies closer than ever before. Elon stood up, his eyes focused on the map of connections they had been tracking for months. "We need to get our hands on more intel." Samantha's offer doesn't change the fact that we're still dealing with a web of power and corruption that runs deep. She's one piece of the puzzle, but we need to know what we're up against. We need to know where she fits in all of this. Ethan felt the weight of Elon's words. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but it wasn't enough. Samantha was dangerous, and if she wasn't lying, they were now walking on a tightrope with no safety net. Still, Ethan couldn't ignore the one thing that gnawed at him, the feeling that they were being watched. "Something feels off," he muttered. "Like we're not the only ones playing the game." Elon raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean, Ethan's voice trailed off as his thoughts collided with reality. I think there's another layer to this. Someone is pulling the strings from behind the curtain, and they've been doing it for a lot longer than we realized. Sarah leaned forward. You think there's someone else? Someone higher up? Ethan nodded slowly. It's not just Samantha. It's too clean, too easy. She's a puppet, and whoever's holding the strings is the one we need to find. We need to figure out who's truly in control, or we'll be playing right into their hands. Elon didn't respond immediately. He tapped his fingers on the table, thinking, you might be onto something. The way she offered us a deal, too confident. Like she knew we'd agree. Like she was one step ahead the whole time. Ethan's mind raced. It was true. There had been something almost rehearsed in Samantha's behavior, as if she knew exactly how each of them would respond. It didn't make sense. She wasn't just protecting herself. She was positioning them. And the question was, why? We need to look deeper, Ethan said, standing up and pacing around the room. We need to track every move she's made, every decision she's been involved in. We need to uncover who she's really working for. Sarah nodded. But how do we even begin? Ethan paused. We go back to the beginning. The judge, Samantha, the company, they're all connected in some way. We dig into their histories, their networks. There's a weak link somewhere. We just need to find it. Elon tapped a few keys on his laptop, and a map of connections filled the screen. It's going to be tough. We're talking about some of the most well-protected individuals in the world. Whoever's at the top has resources that go far beyond anything we've ever encountered. Ethan looked at the map on the screen. It doesn't matter how far they've buried themselves. If we go deep enough, we'll find the cracks. And once we do, we can expose them. The next few days were a blur of research, tracking, and analyzing. They dug into every lead they could find, studying Samantha's past cases, the judge's rulings, the corporations they had ties to. And it didn't take long for a disturbing pattern to emerge. Each thread they pulled on seemed to lead to someone higher up. Someone with more power, more influence, and more to lose than they had ever imagined. It was an old name, one that had been whispered in political circles for years but never fully exposed. Thomas Harrington, a billionaire with ties to government officials, business magnates, and global corporations. He had built his empire on a foundation of secrecy, but Ethan and his team soon discovered that the man was more than just a businessman. He was the mastermind behind the network they had been trying to dismantle. Samantha was just a pawn in his game, as was Judge Hale and the rest of the powerful players they had encountered. This is it, Elon muttered, eyes scanning the documents they had uncovered. He's the one pulling the strings. Everything leads back to him. Ethan stood still, taking in the enormity of the situation. If they could take down Harrington, they could bring the entire network to its knees. But it wouldn't be easy. He was a ghost, untouchable, always one step ahead. We need to get to him, Sarah said, her voice firm. Ethan looked at her, his mind running through the possibilities. We will. But first, we need to get inside his world. We need to find a way to expose him. Elon clicked on a few more files, his face tight with concentration. It's not going to be simple. He's hidden himself so well that even the best investigators can't track him. But if we can find a crack in his armor, we'll have him. Ethan looked out the window, a feeling of resolve building within him. The game had just shifted. They weren't just fighting against the corrupt elite anymore. They were going after the very man at the top, and they would stop at nothing to bring him down. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind swirling with the weight of the task ahead. They were now targeting Thomas Harrington, the man who had orchestrated the entire network of corruption that had been slowly suffocating the world's political and corporate systems. He was the puppet master, the one who controlled everything from behind the shadows. But finding a way to bring him into the light would be no small feat. Elon was hunched over his laptop, fingers flying across the keys as he dug deeper into Harrington's empire. Sarah paced in the corner, her face a mask of determination. Time was running out, and every moment they spent digging into Harrington's life made it clearer that they were up against someone far more dangerous than they had originally realized. We're running out of time, Sarah said, breaking the silence. Harrington is one step ahead of us, always. If we don't act soon, He's going to make his move before we can even get close. I know, Ethan replied, rubbing his temples. The pressure was suffocating. They were in deep, and there was no turning back now. But we can't just go in blind. We need to know everything about him, about how he operates. If we're going to take him down, we need to make sure we have all the pieces in place. Elon paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing. There's one thing we haven't considered yet. Harrington's personal security is more than just physical. He's built a fortress of information around himself. Every move he makes is hidden behind layers of encryption and misdirection. We need to find a way in, literally. Ethan's eyes flashed as the realization hit him. You mean, we need to get to his private server? That's where all his data, his connections, everything is stored. Elon nodded. Exactly. If we can infiltrate his network, we'll be able to access everything. His communications, his financials, his ties to the corrupt officials and businesses. We can expose everything. Sarah stopped pacing and looked at them both. So, how do we get in? We're talking about a man who's literally surrounded by the best cybersecurity in the world. Breaking into his system is like walking through a wall of fire. Ethan's mind raced. They needed a plan, and fast. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. The closer they got to Harrington, the more dangerous it would become. But they couldn't back down now. They had come too far. First, we need to find a way to bypass his security, Ethan said, eyes scanning the map of connections Elon had pulled up. Then, we need to get physical access to his main server. But to do that, we need to get close to him. Very close. Elon's fingers hovered over his keyboard as he pulled up a series of photographs of Harrington's most trusted associates. There's someone within his inner circle we can leverage. A former associate of his named Laura Price. She used to be his head of operations, but she's fallen out of favor with him. She's been trying to expose him for years, but she's been kept under tight control. If we can find a way to get to her, she could be the key to getting close to Harrington. Sarah's eyes narrowed. And you think she'll help us? We have to make her an offer she can't refuse, Ethan replied, his voice steady. We find her, we get her on our side, and she helps us get access to Harrington's private network. The search for Laura Price led them to a small apartment complex in the heart of the city. It wasn't much, a rundown building in a forgotten part of town, but it was all they had. They moved carefully, knowing that any misstep could put them in danger. Ethan, Sarah, and Elon waited in the shadows outside the building, watching the windows for any sign of movement. The plan was simple. Find Laura, make contact, and convince her to help them. But nothing was ever simple in this world. As they approached the building's entrance, they noticed a man watching them from a distance. He wasn't just a bystander. He was watching them with purpose. The air crackled with tension as Ethan's instincts kicked in. They weren't alone. Stay low, he whispered to Sarah and Elon, signaling for them to move quickly. They ducked into a nearby alley, staying out of sight. Ethan's heart pounded as he glanced back, watching the man approach the building with slow, deliberate steps. Something wasn't right. He didn't recognize him, but the man's movements were too calculated. He wasn't just someone who had stumbled across the building. They had been followed. The alley was narrow, with shadows that seemed to stretch for miles, but there was nowhere to hide now. They had to make a decision. We need to get to Laura before they do, Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. They sprinted toward the back of the building, taking the long way around to avoid being seen. As they neared the rear entrance, the door creaked open. A figure stepped out, and Ethan's pulse quickened. It was her, Laura Price. She was older than the photos they had seen, but it was unmistakably her. Her eyes were sharp, focused, and she looked as though she had been waiting for them. You're the ones they've been looking for, she said, her voice steady but tinged with exhaustion. I know who you are, and I know what you're trying to do, but you're running out of time. Ethan took a cautious step forward. We need your help. We know about Harrington. We know what he's capable of. We can't take him down without you. Laura glanced over her shoulder, her gaze calculating. I've been trying to bring him down for years, but I'm not stupid enough to think I can do it alone. You think you're the first ones to come knocking? You're not. But maybe you're the right ones. She stepped aside, opening the door wider. Come inside. We don't have much time. Inside the apartment, Laura led them to a cluttered desk filled with files, laptops, and documents. It was clear she had been doing her own research, tracking Harrington's every move. "I've been gathering intel for years," Laura said, turning her laptop around to show them a series of encrypted files. "This is his weak point. His network is full of holes. If you get the right access, you can take him down. But it's not going to be easy." Elon leaned over her shoulder, eyes scanning the data. "This is exactly what we need. But we'll need more than just a few files. We need to get to his private server, to his real data." Laura nodded. "I know. That's why you're here. I've got a plan to get you in, but it's going to take everything you've got. If we do this, there's no turning back. Harrington will come after you with everything he has." Ethan locked eyes with Laura, his resolve hardening. "We've already crossed the line. We're not turning back now." The pieces were falling into place. They were finally in position to strike at the heart of the beast. And the final move was about to begin. The hours blurred into a haze of preparation. As Ethan, Sarah, Elon, and Laura huddled around her cluttered apartment, a strange sense of calm settled over them. They knew this was the moment that would either make or break everything they had worked for. If they succeeded, it would be the end of Thomas Harrington's reign of corruption. If they failed, they'd be swallowed whole by the very system they had tried to dismantle. Ethan studied the files Laura had pulled up, his mind working overtime to anticipate every possible scenario. The plan was simple: get into Harrington's private server, extract the data, and expose everything. But simplicity was an illusion. They were about to step into the lion's den, and one wrong move could mean their lives. "Are we ready?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence. Laura, who had been unusually quiet for most of the evening, nodded slowly. Her eyes were steely, but there was a flicker of apprehension beneath the surface. "I've been planning this for years, but it's never been this close before. Once we breach his system, there's no going back. Harrington will know what's happened the second we do." Sarah cracked her knuckles, her face grim. "Then let's make sure we do it right. We get in, get the data, and we get out." Elon adjusted his glasses, his fingers moving over his laptop with calculated precision. "I've located his server farm. It's protected by military-grade encryption, but I can bypass it. The real issue is the physical security. There are guards, cameras, and automated defenses. We need to avoid all of it." Ethan stood up, his body tense with anticipation. "We've come this far. We can't back down now. We'll split up into 2 teams. Elon, you'll handle the digital side, the encryption, and the access points. Sarah and I will take care of the physical entry. We meet at the server room, we grab the data, and we get the hell out." Sarah gave him a small nod, her usual sharpness returning. "Sounds like a plan." Laura stood up, pulling a set of blueprints from a drawer. "I'll provide cover from here. I have eyes on all his private security feeds, so I'll direct you through the building." Ethan glanced at each of them, his team. They had become more than just allies. They had become a family, bound together by their shared mission. The trust they had in each other was the only thing that made this possible. "You know the stakes," he said. "If we pull this off, we expose Harrington, destroy everything he's built, and set the world on a different course. But if we fail, we don't just lose. We lose everything, and we lose each other." He looked at Elon and Sarah. "No matter what happens, we stick to the plan." They nodded, each in their own way understanding the gravity of what they were about to do. It was late when they arrived at the towering building that housed Harrington's server farm. The city around them was a blur, the streets quiet except for the occasional hum of passing cars. The night felt like a veil over the world, the calm before the storm. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the sleek, glass and steel building. It seemed almost too quiet, too perfect, too controlled. Everything about it screamed power, power that was beyond their reach, power that had built its empire on corruption, secrecy, and manipulation. They entered through a narrow side door, moving with practiced precision. They had spent weeks preparing for this, memorizing every detail. The door clicked shut behind them with a soft sound, and they slipped into the building's inner sanctum. Laura's voice crackled in their earpieces. "You're in. Head to the security checkpoint on the east side. I've disabled most of the exterior cameras, but you'll still need to avoid the motion sensors. There's a guard patrolling the corridor. Ethan motioned for Sarah to follow. We've got this. They moved quickly, their steps light and purposeful. The building was eerily silent, its sleek, modern design betraying nothing of the danger that lay within. As they turned a corner, they encountered the guard Laura had warned them about. He stood by a door, checking his phone absent-mindedly. Ethan held up a hand, signaling for Sarah to stop. They pressed themselves against the wall, waiting for the guard to pass. Every second felt like an eternity. The tension was almost unbearable. The guard looked up, his eyes scanning the hallway, but he didn't see them. Just as he started to walk away, they moved, their footsteps silent on the polished floor. They passed him by, barely breathing, barely moving. "Clear," Sarah whispered in his ear. They continued down the corridor, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet beneath them. They came to another door, marked with a simple, authorized personnel only sign. Laura's voice came through their earpieces again. "You're almost there. The server room is just behind that door. I've disabled the security lock for now, but you'll need to enter the passcode when you're inside." Ethan pushed the door open slowly, stepping into the small, dimly lit room. The hum of machines filled the air, and rows of servers blinked in the darkness. Elon's voice came through the comms, soft and steady. "I'm in. I've bypassed their main firewall. I'm beginning the data transfer now." Ethan nodded. "Good. We'll hold down the fort. Sarah, keep watch." They set to work, moving quickly but with purpose. They knew they didn't have much time. As they worked, a sudden sound echoed through the comms, a loud, abrupt noise that didn't belong. "Something's wrong," Laura said sharply. "I'm seeing movement. The guards have been alerted. You're not going to have much time." Ethan's pulse spiked. "How much time?" 10 minutes, maybe less," she replied. "Get that data and get out of there now." Ethan glanced at Sarah, who was already moving towards the server racks. "We need to move. Now." They grabbed the data drives, their hands shaking, their minds focused on nothing but getting out alive. The seconds felt like hours, but they finally had everything they needed. Elon's voice came through again, more urgent this time. "The system's alerted. I've transferred the data, but we're not alone anymore." A loud crash echoed through the hallway, followed by the sounds of footsteps rushing toward them. "We've been compromised," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Time to move." They sprinted toward the exit, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The sound of alarms blared in their ears as they rounded the corner and headed for the side door. Laura's voice was frantic now. "Get out. Now." As they reached the exit, they were met by a wall of guards, their weapons drawn and eyes cold with the promise of violence. Ethan's heart raced. They had no choice now. They had to fight their way out. The next few minutes were a blur of adrenaline and chaos. They fought their way through the guards, using every skill they had to stay one step ahead. But they couldn't fight forever. Just when things seemed to be falling apart, a car screeched to a halt in front of them. Laura, who had somehow managed to stay one step ahead, had arranged an escape. "Get in," she shouted, and they dove into the car.